He's the historian. Welcome back. Tonight we're doing part two of the collapse of Imperial Japan. Joining me this evening is Sean Chick. So we're going to be taking things up to the end of 1944, as I understand it. So Sean, how's it going?
I'm okay, man. Sorry about having to cancel on Thursday, but due to certain matters, there was no way I could, hang out for a few hours and talk about Japan losing a bunch of battles, you know. And I used the pause to do some more research as well, especially in the Burma campaign,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, that's also
So
mostly what I
sorry
looked
about,
up for this.
yeah, yeah. And there's also, oh, what else too? No, that, yeah. And to take a break from that, was watching things on video games in the 1990s. You know. Oh, let me turn that off over here real quick. Forgot to turn the phone off. All
Oh,
right.
yeah.
Let's
What
see.
kinds
Okay,
of
got it.
what kinds of systems were you learning about from the 90s?
Uh, Not systems as much as games, but something I was kind of thinking about was, well, I was looking back at things like Dark Forces, Wolfenstein 3D, and then uh, found this video. The guy was talking about Star Wars games, and Star Wars is was especially in the 1990s was like, if a game was a Star Wars game, there was a good chance it was good. Of course, not all of them. You had the wretched NES Star Wars and the Empire Strikes Back games, but and of course the NES Star Wars is notorious for. I think in the Japanese version, you fight Darth Vader and then he turns into a scorpion.
Whoa. Okay, I don't remember that.
You know,
Then again, I never made it very
yeah, yeah,
far in any of those games, so
yeah, man. The Empire Strikes Back one was better, but I mean they just weren't that good. But LucasArts was doing a lot of great games in the 90s, not just Star Wars, not just Star Wars and Indiana Jones. And anyway, the guy was talking about he was showing like almost every year they were putting out these big Star Wars games. So you had the Super Star Wars trilogy for SNES, Rebel Assault 2, the Dark Forces Jedi Knight series,
right.
you know. Um, and there were so many games they were making. In fact, I would say the games they made for the prequels are better than the goddamn movies. you know?
Agreed, absolutely. The,
And
the prequel games are actually pretty good. They're much better than the
yeah,
movies.
and then he shows that right when Disney buys it, they just don't really put that many games out anymore, except for like mobile games and whatnot. And
Well, they
that's
have recently.
because they have recently.
Yeah, like the last
Well,
five
I mean,
years
you
or
can say they
so.
weren't putting out. Okay, and it wasn't saying that they weren't putting out nothing though, but like the productivity was down and a lot of the creativity because a lot of people were big fans of what Knights of the Old Republic.
Right.
I remember I never played it, but people liked it, and I saw people playing it, and I was impressed by what I saw.
Yeah, there's a lot of
You know,
pressure right now to do a remaster of that because actually they have approved remasters. I just downloaded recently the remastered Dark Forces, like the Doom ripoff. Um, it looks pretty cool. I haven't gotten a chance to try it yet. They also released Star Wars Squadrons a few years ago, which is like an online multiplayer where you can either play for the Empire or the Republic and fly all the iconic ships. So yeah,
cool.
there's a lot of stuff that's come out the last 5 or so years, and I believe that they also have a lot of RPGs, kind of like Knights of the Old Republic. Like Force Unleashed came out in the early 2010s, and then there's something very similar to I think it's called Jedi Survivor or something like that.
Yeah, that's the Survivor one. Yeah, Force Unleashed. I want to say that's before the Disney buyout.
If it was like right before. It wouldn't have been very long before it, but yeah. So I haven't
It,
really played a lot of those. But speaking back of Rebel Assault 1 and 2, I actually played the shit out of those as a kid. I had the first one for Sega CD and the sequel for PlayStation.
Never a big fan of Rebel Assault, but at the same time, it was one of those games that really showed off what your PC could do. Like they had those cut scenes and everything, and then they really upped the ante when they did Jedi Knight, Dark Forces too.
Right. They also had
Because
X-wing and Tie Fighter, I think, in that same period, but that was for people who
oh
were
yeah, yeah,
PC
X-wing
nuts.
X-wing Tie Fighter series. It's funny. I only ever played X-wing once because this one guy I knew is his dad like worked on computers. Like he had a whole room of this stuff, and he did computer repair, but he also had his own projects and everything. Big Star Wars fan, so we go to his place, and he had like the most advanced computers at that time. And I got to play X-Wing one time for 3 hours. That was fucking great, man.
Yeah, one game I missed out on. Somebody in the comments mentioned it, but Empire at War was like an RTS Star Wars game from maybe like the very early 2000s, and that was
Early
one
2000s on that one.
that was one I've wanted to play for a long time, and I just have not gotten around to it.
There's also a turn-based one where I forget the name of that one. It came out like in maybe 1998. It plays the Empire of the Rebellion. And I think Star Wars it's a good topic for gaming in general. A lot of Star Wars board games are also really good. And this is not just the 90s. I mean, the old Star Wars arcade that Atari put out. I've actually played the arcade machine itself. Amazing. Just they actually used voices on there. I mean I love that 80s line art look, right? And they
Right.
have it perfect in that one. So I'm looking at that game. I'm like, man, that blew people away at the time, and I was impressed too with the presentation. That's definitely one of, not my favorite, early arcade games
There was also Star
of
Wars
its type.
Arcade by Sega in the 90s that they ported to 32X.
Late '90s.
No, this was early 90s. Like the game
Yeah,
itself was like 93, and then the port was about 1995.
Oh, I'm talking about a different Star Wars arcade. I'm talking about the one that came out in the late '90s where you play through the trilogy. And I mean, the thing 8 quarters, but I mean, it's a big machine, very impressive presentation. You even got the lightsaber
Right.
duel, Darth Vader, Return of the Jedi stuff. So, you know, you know
Right.
what I mean. So, and pretty amazing stuff with that. And I just looking at that, the other reason I'm sorry, looking at that, one of the things that started to make it kind of sad was seeing in the 1990s there was so many different genres innovations happening, and the amount of time. I mean, Wolfenstein 3D comes out in 1992, Doom is 93, Dark Forces in 1995. You did call Dark Forces a Doom ripoff. I would not call it that. I would call Duke Nukem a Doom ripoff.
Well, yeah, I
Because
mean, it's
Dark
more of a ripoff.
Forces, yeah, Dark Forces, like they intentionally wanted to. They were really impressed by Wolfenstein. They started working on it, and then Doom came out, and they were very much like, well, we're not making a Doom clone. I mean, they just play so differently,
I mean, I played a fair
and you
amount
can
of
jump
Dark
in Dark
Forces on.
Forces, look up and down.
Yeah, I played a lot of Dark Forces on PlayStation. Well, I did for a little bit, and then the graphics at that time. By the time I got my copy of it, this was only a few years ago. So that's why I got the remastered because
Yeah,
it won't give me a headache playing it. Um, but yeah, that's actually
how's
next
the
on my
remaster?
list. It looks pretty cool. I've
Okay.
not actually gotten to play it yet, but also I'm about to leave town for a couple weeks. I'm going to my sister's wedding, so I will only be able to start playing it once I return. But yeah, that's next on my list
And
of
the
shit to
other
play.
one, another one I mentioned too is you get Half Life, which is 1998. Oh yeah, and in between Dark Force and Half Life, you have Jedi Knight, which had those live action cutscenes with lightsabers, like the first lightsaber footage filmed since Return of the Jedi.
Right.
And there's big epic games, and you think about it, from 1992 to from Wolfenstein to Half Life, it's only about 6 years.
It's true. Yeah, I didn't think of that,
And
but you're right.
yeah, there's a kind of embarrassment of riches to that. But I was telling somebody, I also started to get the feeling that maybe I was spoiled video game wise to be in this era where they were just pumping out these great games, and those studios at the time were relatively small, and
Right.
they were doing. I mean, they do things that were kind of wacky. For instance, I was reading about Desert Strike because I love that game, and Desert Strike, the guy who developed it for Electronic Arts, and by the way, by this time, Electronic Arts is not a big juggernaut. They're just one of many different companies. They put out a few more games than most. A lot of Sega Genesis stuff, as I remember.
A lot of
Like for instance, Desert
sports.
Strike was made for, yeah, a lot of sports, right? So it was not the juggernaut you see today. But they did something like Desert Strike, and the case of Desert Strike, just looking into it, like the guys talking about The idea comes from him playing a game called Chopper Lift for Sega Master System, which I'd never heard of. Apparently, it's a well thought of Sega Master System game.
Yeah,
So he
it's one of
loved
those.
that
It was
game.
great at the time. It's very difficult to get into now, though.
Yeah. But he was playing that game, was a fan of that game, and then he also had a bunch of Matchbox cars. So he starts messing around, like almost like a kid playing with like toy cars and vehicles, and being like, "Hey, why don't we do a game like this, where you have this kind of view? You're in a helicopter attacking vehicles, but you're also doing some of the stuff you did in Chopper Lift.
Right.
You know, just a lot of. I mean, these people want to make money, of course. But there's also like a lot of creativity and passion for this stuff. Another one to mention as well, even before Wolfenstein 3D, id Software did Catacombs of the Abyss, which I think they made that in Shreveport because they were based out of Shreveport for a little while, or they're working in Shreveport.
Right.
So they were what you would do is the early id Software games we was done through soft disk, and the computers that I had at my high school had the soft disk games. So the way the computer lab worked is when your work was done, you could play a game. So I played Catacombs of the Abyss, and I got to like the last level, but then the semester ended.
Oh
you know?
shit.
So I never got to beat it. Yeah, but that game is proto Wolfenstein 3D. You know, the movement isn't as dynamic, but you're doing the same thing. You got a hand out, and you're just shooting like fireballs at zombies and skeletons and demons and
Oh
stuff.
yeah, that game.
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah, I loved playing that one. So they, and also I didn't even mention Quake, which I wasn't a big Quake fan, but I saw other people were, and was really big for making online play popular. And then, of course, the modified Quake engine's basis of Half Life.
Yeah.
It's just it was exciting to see all those innovations happening in the 1990s, and of course they've come out with great games since then. But that was just uh, a very creative, energetic period.
Right, and a lot of it I think was fueled by Sega because actually, Sega's been criticized for making bad business decisions, but pretty much if they just had an idea that they liked, they'd just do it. So for Genesis, they basically created a kind of Netflix for games, where you could log into
Yeah.
something and download games off of there, or maybe play them on a like kind of like how you run Netflix, where you play them off the site. I mean, it didn't work super well because the internet wasn't quite there yet, but they had the
Yeah.
idea and the service up. And then next generation Saturn, you could actually browse the web. So Sega Saturn had a built-in
Hmm.
modem, or maybe you had to get a separate modem. I
Oh yeah,
forget,
yeah.
but there was a way to do that. They had a mouse and keyboard attachment. Dreamcast had the same thing, and then Dreamcast also had the ability to play games online like you could on a PC, which was still new at the time because
Hmm.
Dreamcast came out, what, 98, 99. So, I mean, Sega, once Sega left the console market, companies became a lot more cautious. And at this point, I mean, Microsoft and Sony still do some innovation, but Nintendo plays it 100% safe at all times. They take no financial risk
It's
whatsoever.
interesting. That's interesting to note because the Wii, I wasn't a fan of the Wii, but I got why people loved it. Why it was such a big hit at the time.
It was also extremely
That's
profitable
what.
because the components were all very, very cheap. So they made a lot of money off of
Yeah.
every unit sold, whereas other consoles usually sell at a loss or at a very minor profit. And then you make all your money off of licenses and games.
Yeah. Oh man, and one do want to mention that when you mentioned about the Wii, besides the components being cheap, that was one of the few times I saw something come out that was that something was video game related that really people loved when it first came out. I mean, they really liked the Wii. I'd rarely seen anything as big a hit as that was at that moment.
It's
You
the
know.
second biggest
Uh,
selling console of all time behind the PS2.
yeah. Yeah, the PS2 is the PS2. I think half of that success is to play DVDs.
Absolutely, it is. That being said,
Yeah, really.
it moved hardware.
Yeah. It did. No, it did, man. But I mean, that's why everybody was like, "This is the ultimate entertainment platform," you know. And I remember, God, when my DVD player broke, or when I was waiting for my Blu-ray player, I was using the PlayStation 2 to play DVDs.
I
I still have
actually
a PS2 over here.
my main DVD player from I guess the time I got my PS2 and I think I got it when it was a year old, about 2001. So from 2001 until I got my Xbox 360 in 2015, that was my primary DVD player. So for me, that was a very long period where I was relying heavily on the PS2 for all DVDs.
Yeah, no, so there was um uh, I mean there was just a lot of creative energy in video games in the 1990s and a lot of leaps in technology. Um, one of the things I really one thing there was one thing in the 90s I really didn't like though, which is really when I became more interested in I played more computer games in the late 90s because I wasn't big on the PlayStation 1 or the N64 because I feel like they were trying to jump into 3D before they're actually. I mean, I think they were trying to jump into 3D before most of them were actually even ready. And I think I'm sorry, Castlevania Symphony of the Night shows that if they were kind of just making, they could have made like the ultimate versions of games from the Genesis Super Nintendo era.
Well, that's exactly what
Instead
Saturn
of,
did in
hey,
Japan.
yeah, that's great, man. Instead of being like, hey, a Mario 64 worked because that's Nintendo, and when it comes to Mario games, they typically like go all out and make sure it's actually good, right?
Right.
But yeah, like okay, like Castlevania on Nintendo 64. I don't think it's as horrible as some people say, but it's not great.
No,
I
and
mean, Symphony
also,
of the Night's way better.
yeah, I think too, part of the problem with some of the systems of that period is they would be innovative with controllers to their detriment. I mean, if you look at the N64 controller, there's a reason that's never been replicated. I mean, if you look at the Dreamcast controller, which
Yeah.
is probably the worst of all, and I'm a huge Sega fan, but I actually despise the Dreamcast controller. And to this day, I have not played Dreamcast for more than like 30 minutes at a time because I despise the controller so much. Um,
It's a bad one.
it's a
I'll say
terrible
this:
one.
the controller I hate the most by a mile is Nintendo 64. That's terrible. That's painful, man. You know. But
Yeah,
do you have any more you want to say on that
I
little like friendly opener, or do you want to get into Japan?
I think we can get into Japan. I guess it does make a good opener since I mean Japan went from being known for warmongering to being known for video games, and almost every system we talked about originated in Japan. Um, Also, just last point,
Yeah.
you're talking about Saturn. One thing I need to do, and you probably do too, is to get a Saturn emulator to play all the like really high end 2D games from that period. Because Saturn actually was the leading
Okay.
system in Japan. Maybe well, PlayStation might have beaten it by a bit, but it was definitely very competitive, and they had some really kick ass games that were super 16-bit games, effectively.
Yeah.
But
It's always interesting that is one to note, because you know more about Sega than I do, but it's always interesting to note that each one of their systems they launch, it'll be like a big hit in one region, but not in the other too.
yeah, no, Sega's had that issue. I think, and that way Microsoft is the new Sega, except that they have infinite pockets. Because actually, I don't think any Xbox system has ever sold well outside of the U.S. Maybe a couple of them have done okay in Europe, but none of them have ever penetrated Japan.
You know what though? I will say this, and I don't really play a ton of Xbox, but what I see from their stuff, and of course Halo is the big one, right? I mean, those games are just Xbox is really American. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Now, I'm a big fan of Xbox. I love their Game Pass, and I like the controller and
Okay.
hardware and all that. That being said, I'm the only one in my family who plays it, so I'm excited about cross-platform stuff because now I can actually play with people. Um, but yeah, any of you who play anything
Yeah, I
online on Xbox, let me know.
Naturally, of course, PlayStation, amazing controller, and the both Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo had great controllers. The NES controller was not that good.
No, the NES controller sucks.
I mean,
It was fine for its era, but
it has a good it has a good aesthetic though. The Atari controller does what it does.
yeah. Also,
You know what I
interesting
mean?
note
The Atari
about it.
2600 controller does what it does.
If you have a Sega Genesis controller, it actually will work on an Atari because they use the same input.
Yeah,
So that's what a lot of people do is just put
yeah.
like the 10 people who actually still play Atari.
The 10 people, I might be more like 20.
Yeah.
Uh, No, I mean, well, if I'm gonna play Atari 2600, it's going to be like arcade games like Centipede or something like classics. Although the Superman on Atari 2600 was actually a pretty good one. But then again, there's just so much garbage on that thing because and also the limitations. I mean, it is the crudest system, understandably so. I
Right.
will say this though, man, Atari game art looks great, and a lot of the promotional posters. I mean, they really do make it look like Atari is the future.
Oh no,
And
yeah,
also,
they
it
definitely
is still
do.
the best name for a game. Dude, this is the best name for a game company. Still is Atari. It just sounds great.
It does. You're right. No, I've always liked the sound of Atari.
You know.
I guess it was one of those things that was a little too before my time,
Yeah,
so I've not really been able to
yeah,
appreciate it,
and
unfortunately.
also the last thing to know about that, very last thing on that one is, people were in the early aughts were still like saying like, "Fuck it, let's dust off our Nintendo and play Punch Out." And that's within 1 month. I knew these two guys were really good at Punch Out, and saw both of them beat Mike Tyson within like a month, which is amazing, right?
Yeah,
That's a, you know, and or people would be like, "Yeah, screw it, let's have a Super Nintendo night," and people actually would do it for hours or something. Man, once Nintendo came out, Atari 2600, you almost never saw those things. Whenever I did, they're usually collecting dust. So you got your Super Mario Brothers going and stuff. People are not being like, "Hey man, let's have an Atari time." They're like, "Nah, that one's done." Um, so and also those systems weren't that common, and at least around here to begin with. You might see them in a cabinet or something collecting dust, and nobody really talked about them either. So you were either going to be playing Nintendo or you were going to the arcade.
yeah.
Especially like yeah. So let me see. So you are ready for us to finish out 1944 for the Empire of Japan?
Sure. Yeah, let's do
All right.
1944, the year
What's
where
left of it?
they
I
did
know
not turn it
last.
around.
No, no, no. Although they're going to have this one stunning success, right? We'll get into that one a bit. Okay, we're going to be talking about the Marianas battles. I'm going to finish up with that one, the fall of Tojo, and then I think just because it'll make narrative sense, the Pacific is to talk about Palau and the Philippines, and then do Burma and China.
Okay.
Okay, and I was saying this up front, we are not doing Leyte Gulf today. I'm just going to mention the battle in cursory and its effects. That battle is so complicated. There's so many things going on, and there's some new books that have come out on it, new research on it, especially looking at what the Japanese were trying to do. So I want to read up on that, and maybe we can do a Leyte Gulf stream. I think that's a battle that deserves a stream on its own. You know, so I'm not doing Leyte Gulf in particular. All right.
All right.
So where were we? That's right. The aircraft carrier Helios sank. The American aircraft returned in darkness, allowed them in a ditch, but most of the pilots were saved. And so the Battle of Philippine Sea is the largest carrier battle in history. So in history, it's the largest carrier battle of World War II. The Japanese were decisively defeated, although two of the three carriers they lost were due to submarines. And I always consider it to be an odd battle because the losing admiral was the better commander and actually made smarter decisions overall. When I say smart decisions, experience wasn't an idiot or anything. I just mean that Ozawa fought as good a battle as he could. The Japanese have, and they have this especially in 1944, is believing over the top results. So Ozawa was told by the pilots he returned, but specifically by not Takagi, Katuka, who was the air commander in the Marianas, that they were really cleaning their clocks. And actually, this will influence Leyte Gulf. The Japanese went into Leyte Gulf thinking they'd actually just delivered the Americans some serious naval losses, which they had most certainly not done. Right. And I guess at that point, you start losing, so then you start grasping on, and you start grasping on to things that tell you what you want to hear, right?
Right.
So that Ozawa's one mistake is him believing that the aircraft had inflicted heavy losses. which they, of course, had not.
Even you're
Anyway,
talking about how
so
some of the
we're
U.S.
going to.
pilots had to ditch their planes, but I mean,
Mhm.
by this point, you look at U.S. production, and that would have been completely meaningless as long as the pilots made it, because then you just issue them a newer, slightly better aircraft, and they're back in action within 48 hours.
Yeah. So we're going to get into the attacks on the Marianas. These will be the battles for Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. A few things to note about this one. The Americans are actually attacking ahead of schedule in the Pacific. And they do two things in the Pacific that they really can't do in Europe. This is really ingenious. So Spruance is the carrier commander for this battle. What the Americans started doing was that one period Spruance would be in charge, the next time it'd be Halsey. So while Spruance is fighting the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Halsey is getting ready for when he takes over, which is going to be for Formosa and Leyte Gulf. And then after that, you get Spruance back there, and then Halsey again. So they're cycling through commanders. This gives commanders time to rest, but allows staffs to plan. They're doing the same thing with their divisions. So in the European theater, of course, some divisions are sent to the rear to rest and refit, but generally speaking, you have to keep as many divisions in the front as possible. In the case of the Battle of the Bulge, for instance, one of the divisions, I forget which, there were two divisions that I know of in the Battle of the Bulge, the 2nd Infantry and I want to say 28th. They were there to rest and refit. They're sent to a quiet sector, right? And that means you're still at the front. And of course, that's going to become a front for a massive battle in December 1944. In the case of the Pacific, you can have a unit pulled out and then rest them for as long as you want. The 1st Marines, after being pulled out of Guadalcanal, rested for quite a bit of time, and then were put on New Britain with Cape Gloucester.
Right.
Um,
And they had a
so,
long sojourn in Melbourne, Australia.
oh yeah, that episode of the TV show. That
Yeah, I was just
it seems that
watching that.
everybody hates that episode. Yeah, it seems like everybody. A lot of people know, God, that episode was terrible. I'm like, I actually really liked it
I
myself.
did too. I thought that was
Uh,
the best episode so far because I think I've watched the first 3 episodes now. So
yeah. Oh, you'll love it when they get to Palau. that's that's hell on earth. Uh, I think probably I really like the last 2 episodes with Okinawa and them going back. But anyway, so anyways, oh by the way, fun fact about that show, uh, that show went something like $100 million over budget, which for a TV show is completely insane. I mean, actually, that'd be insane for a movie too. But I've heard of movie budgets ballooning beyond double. You know, Apocalypse Now is an infamous example, right?
right.
But man, a TV show they usually have that stuff much more disciplined. So anyway, they're attacking on Saipan. Interesting to note that the overall commander was actually Naguma, who was the carrier commander for Pearl Harbor, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands. Uh, After the Santa Cruz Islands, he was removed and replaced with Ozawa. There's a lot of reasons for Naguma being there. On the one hand, you get an experienced officer with a prominent name. Naguma was also pretty good at working with people overall. But of course, him and Yamamoto did not like each other, and people had blamed him for the carrier losses. Fun little story about Naguma, apparently. While the Americans are shelling Saipan, he looked over and noticed that they were shelling them with battleships that he knew had been sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Huh. Just based on the names, or
Yeah, that's got to be Demore. No, he just recognized the ship,
oh,
you know.
because they had raised a lot of them and put them back out.
Exactly. I'm trying to remember which one it might have been. Maybe West Virginia. Uh, of course, that's why several of those Pearl Harbor battleships are in Tokyo Bay when they surrender, naturally, right? So what's going to happen is that the commander in charge of the land forces of Saipan is General Holland Smith, a Marine Corps commander who is considered to be the expert in amphibious warfare. Do you know much about this guy?
I've heard of him, but I don't know that much about him.
He was called Howling Mad Smith because he was known for being really angry and being very testy with subordinates. Now, the thing is, when he wasn't in the war, people talked about how he was fairly mild-mannered, intelligent, but he Now, some people would say maybe he just lost his temper a bunch, but Smith seems to have actually believed in using controlled anger to get what he wanted. The problem is he was constantly critical of both the Army and the Navy, so he did not get along with Richmond and Turner. And Turner, remember, is the Navy's amphibious expert. Now, Turner himself was also a very taciturn, difficult man. Uh, Smith is a very aggressive commander. And keep this in mind, the American Army in World War II is not that aggressive, especially if you compare them to other militaries. We're one of the more careful ones. And typically what we would do in Europe and the Pacific is you find where the enemy is, you stop, you shell them, you call in air support. If that's not enough, then you do it again, right? And the Marines would be an exception. The Marines tended to be more aggressive, and Smith really put that aggressive spirit into them. And he has a very negative opinion of Army tactics. He thought they were taking things too slowly in the Battle of Antioch, and then, of course, here in Saipan, because eventually, because the losses, because the battle is, it's a big battle, losses are heavy. He calls in the 27th Division, led by Ralph Smith, and eventually Holland Smith fired Ralph Smith. And you have to understand that for a Marine general to fire an Army general, and one who was fairly well thought of as well. And one of the reasons is because when they were advancing, the Marines advanced ahead of the Army division, leaving their flanks exposed. But truth be told, the 27th Division was facing tougher resistance. And another thing to keep in mind, too, at the Pacific War is when it comes to the way resources are allocated between the three branches, Army, Air Force, Navy. And I say Air Force, we mean Army Air Force in this case. But
right.
The Navy, of course, is putting their best ships, their best commanders into this one, right? And the Air Force adhered to the 70-30 rule, which was 70% of your resources go to Europe, 30 into the Pacific. They did that scrupulously, but they typically made sure that the newest aircraft went to Europe first. All right, but the Air Force in the Pacific, the Army Air Force, is not shortchanged. They get the percentage that they're allotted.
I guess they also got almost all the P-38s, too.
Oh, yeah. Well, that one was deemed not to be as good. Also, we gave a lot of those to the Soviets, too.
Well, I mean, to be fair,
anyway,
it was much better in the Pacific because of the range on the damn thing. And then also having that extra engine is useful when you're flying over,
I'm sorry,
vast
P-38. I'm sorry. I thought you said P-39.
No. The P-39, yeah, we gave almost all those to the Russians, so that was not... the Era Cobra was not exactly top-notch.
It did fine with the Russians. I mean, they wanted, the Russians wanted tough fighters that could hold up in the elements, and the P-39 is pretty good for that. It was never a great fighter though. The P-38, P-38 Lightning. The other theater where it's heavily used was the Mediterranean for the same reason. You have to go a lot. You have to go some pretty long distances.
Yeah.
So anyways, So P-38 heavily used in Mediterranean and, of course, Pacific theater. The Army in 1942 had to put more divisions into the Pacific just to stem the tide. Of course, by 1943, they're throwing more stuff into Europe. What I typically find is the Army at that point will send divisions that might be questionable. So, for instance, the 27th Division here is a National Guard division. There's several National Guard divisions sent to the Pacific Theater. Some of these are divisions where men are over 35. So the Army is not sending a lot of their best divisions to begin with. All right. So Holland Smith fired Ralph Smith. So what am I going to say? Oh, another thing that contributes to defeat in the Saipan, you're going to see this throughout the Pacific War now, is that the submarines are getting good. They're attacking convoys successfully. So a lot of the units that would be shipped to reinforce an island would arrive and be like, yeah, we're here, but we lost half our men on the way. Or we're here, but our artillery's in the bottom of the ocean now.
Damn.
So Saipan, and increasingly a lot of these island battles, you start getting a mishmash of forces on the island. So that plays a big part in that one. Um, and what's interesting too about Saipan is uh, it was the first time we're going to run into a lot of Japanese civilians. They were kind of essentially colonizing the island, and in the course of the battle, some 22,000, I read by one estimate, died, which includes
20,000
Korean
civilians.
laborers as well. Yeah, most infamously towards the end of the battle, they were committing suicide and jumping off the cliffs. Now, Saipan has a psychological effect on the Americans in two regards. One, Saipan, the victories of Saipan and the Philippine Sea causes a major boost to American morale. Like soldiers are like, because Saipan was a knockdown, drag out fight. This wasn't like Kwajalein, where it's a an island that would be that was almost indefensible. Saipan is an island you can defend. So, in fact, the Americans win both those battles, those engagements, and also in the case of the carrier battle, keeping in mind the last carrier battle was Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese won that one. It's a Pyrrhic victory, but they still won the battle, sinking the Hornet. To do what we did shows just how much better we are. So morale is soaring in a lot of ways, but the deaths of all those civilians, watching them jump off of cliffs, I read accounts, of course, of Americans seeing that, or then seeing the effects of it and just breaking down and crying, or asking why are these people killing themselves? And this also leads to something else too, the biggest bonsai charge of the entire war. So Naguma and the army commander, they commit ritual suicide, and then 3,000 Japanese launch in a bonsai attack. Now, bonsai attacks, remember, they're not tactically very smart, but this one did surprise some units and overran a few. So this one actually did cause heavy losses to the Americans, all things considered. But those 3,000 people in that attack, that included civilians. That included people who were wounded. There were people who had no guns. They simply took like bamboo and would tie knives to it. So we have a spear charge going on, and they had to massacre them almost to the man, of course. So
Yeah, I guess that's
psychologically,
where.
also the way Saipan affects the Americans.
Isn't this also where the Marines and others
Wait, go
figured
ahead.
out the best defense against the bonsai charge was using their pistols?
I don't know about that. I know them. I know on when they do a bonsai charge, your machine gun matters a lot.
Yeah, they showed that in the Pacific pretty
Um,
well. Maybe it wasn't quite a bonsai charge, but there was a charge in one scene, and some of the guys were just sitting around watching their machine gunner just kick ass. Because the machine gunner was
I
just
think
taking
that's
down clumps
Alligator
of
Creek.
dudes. Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that was probably that was. I think that was probably Alligator Creek. That's a notorious one. So there's the bonsai charge there. It's, I mean, ultimately, what do they do? I think they inflict 600 losses on us. They lose almost 3,000 men, which is not great, right? But you had bonsai charges I've read about where there'll be a few hundred guys who charge, and it'll be like American losses 1.
Yeah. Shit.
This one though, this one got some surprise and had a lot of people on it, but also you got these people. They realize like we're gunning down guys who essentially are charging us with spears. And so there does start to be a this battle in particular does also create a psychological toll where people are wondering what is it going to be like if we actually have to invade Japan? What kind of hell is that going to be? That's where Saipan's where people start asking that question.
Well, I guess to be fair, given how much the American attitude at the time against the Japanese, I imagine most of the guys were thinking, well, I guess we're going to have to really take up all the cargo space on our ships with ammo because that's clearly going to be what we need.
Or did they think? I mean, how can I say this? Like, they're the guys who actually have to do it. And Saipan is the first battle where you do start having American soldiers starting to be like sympathizing with what's going on to the Japanese. Like those civilians I'm talking about, the ones who don't kill themselves, other ones are massacred by Japanese soldiers themselves, ordered to kill themselves. Now it's then one of the problems when you get to a battle like Saipan or Palau is that we don't have many survivors, right? So we only have a few people on the Japanese side who can say this, this, and this happened. So I'm willing to bet a lot of those civilians who were in the bonsai charge, there some of them volunteered. I'm willing to bet a few of them were people forced in because they were able-bodied men. You know?
Right.
But once again, it's hard to know since just about everybody died. Anyways, so this is where you do start having some sympathy for the Japanese, the civilians at least, not the army soldiers. But nevertheless, Saipan is, despite all of its controversies, and we do take heavy losses uh, in the battle, but the Japanese, of course, in the end lose. They lost more men. Our losses are replaceable. And remember, the way the Pacific War works is that after your division has done one of these meat grinder battles, well, you get a period of rest to get ready for the next one. Uh, which actually, Saipan, the other one too, is the Battle of Tinian. There's not too much to say for Tinian, but Tinian is one of the best executed battles of the Pacific War for the Americans, because Tinian itself has a small garrison, smaller island. Tinian's relatively flat, so not defensible, but defensible at the beaches. There's really only two spots to land because Tinian is kind of like a plateau with cliffs almost, right? So the Army and Navy on Tinian were making, and that Army Navy coordination in the Pacific War, people joke about how bad it is. This is true. But you'll have instances where the Army and Navy do work well together. This is not one of them. They're working at cross purposes. Furthermore, the Japanese, there were two beaches we could use, and we decided to boldly go for what they called White Beach. White Beach was the easier one for the Japanese to defend, but the Japanese garrison is small, so they put almost everything into defend the other beach, believing we would have to land there. So we pressed up through this narrow cliff areas, and the bombardment of the area was lighter than usual, and then usually is a problem. But the one thing with heavy bombardments is you do let the enemy know where you're coming. So we did a short but very effective barrage, landed, penetrate through the cliffs, and then Tinian is wrapped up. One of our best executed battles in the Pacific for sure.
Right.
And I guess I'll do Guam real quick here. You got any questions or any observations?
No, I've never heard of Tinian before, but I guess if it went off without a hitch, that would probably explain it. 'Cause I feel like only the bloodbath battles
Yeah,
tend to get advertised.
very true. And also, I mean, I'd always heard about Tinian, but like I said, it's the smaller of the islands. There was some debate about even taking. I mean, Saipan and Guam were given. Were definitely going to be taken. Guam has to be retaken because it was an American territory that was seized in December 1941. Not much of a battle on Guam, by the way. The Japanese just kind of you could walk around the entire island in a day, like the circumference of the island.
That makes sense. I'm surprised it's actually
That's
that
it.
big. I thought it'd be smaller than that.
Guam has very rough terrain, so Guam is going to be a pretty tough battle. But going to Guam, we have two advantages. One of them is a guy named George R. Tweed. George R. Tweed, and actually I want to look something up just to make sure about something with him. But one thing that happened is for Guam, we did capture documents on Saipan that let us know what was going to happen. Okay, so I'm sorry, not what was happening, but like at least what the Japanese had there waiting for us. All right, let me look this up with Tweed here. So this guy, he evaded the Japanese for 2 years on Guam. Made contact with us and helped us with intelligence on how to attack the island. Damn
Damn.
impressive, huh?
It is, yeah. I mean
Yeah,
this
because we just
guy's
talk about. Yeah,
this guy's a hardcore.
I mean the only other one I know of like that was the Kiska, the U.S. meteorological team on Kiska and the Aleutian Islands had a dog that survived being on the island. So, so yeah, so no, so this guy he survived on Guam. He helped out with intelligence on the for us to attack. Um, so what happens is we do our heavy naval and air attacks. Um, the Japanese are mostly actually inland to defend the ridges. This is a big deal because the Japanese tended to defend at the beach's edge. Now, in a place like Kwajalein, that's their or Tarawa, they were forced to. But Saipan and Guam, you could go one way or the other. Saipan, they tried to hold at the beaches and launch counterattacks. And those counterattacks were blown apart by naval gunfire. When the Japanese counterattack, they usually do it at night. They do one of the last great bonsai charges, but this one, it could be called like a semi-bonsai. Instead of just a suicidal dash for your honor, there's actually some planning to this one, and it happened early in the battle as well. So the Japanese actually managed to penetrate the defensive perimeter at some points, I believe, and famously, like the hospitals at the beach's edge actually had to, the orderlies and everything had to grab their guns and defend themselves, for instance. Um, Fun fact about that one too. The Japanese, though, by that time kind of were figuring out these bonsai charges never work. So a lot of the ones in this attack were drunk, and some of the units that took part burned their flags to make sure that they couldn't be captured. Okay. Um,
Damn.
Although one of the attacks, I said it was better coordinated. One of the attacks, there was one Marine position on Guam where they counted 256 bodies. Not a single Marine died. Okay.
So it was like an intense
But
firefight,
here's
and
where
when
they
the
get
smoke cleared, it was one-sided.
after the Banzai charge fails, Imperial Japanese headquarters sends an order to them. It says, defend to the last, they essentially said, defend to the last man to buy time. Okay? So this is where you start getting the idea with the Japanese of not destroying the ocean's edge, not doing Banzai charges, but try to hold the island as long as possible, inflict as many losses as possible. And that is to buy time for the Japanese to improve their defenses elsewhere, in particular to prepare for the defense of Japan itself. Now, some of the advantages that we had at Guam, the Japanese were pretty cruel towards the locals there. So, and this is one of these islands we like on Saipan. Remember, Saipan was kind of colonized. Guam had not happened, so we have a lot of help from locals, guides, and whatnot. Fun thing, when before them putting the flag on Mount Suribachi, a big deal was the planting of the American flag at the Marine Corps barracks, where they actually, when they put the flag up, they played music on a captured Japanese bugle. Yeah. Now, the thing, though, one other thing that happened in Guam as well is the Marines are so aggressive that they actually had created a lot of pockets of Japanese that slipped through. And it also didn't help that there were bad maps, which led to a lot of friendly fire. So, a Marine guy would come in and say, hey, I need fire at this position. The artillery then shells them or somewhere else entirely. I mentioned that with the Japanese slipping through. Guam became notorious for having a lot of Japanese who remained on the island decades afterwards. I believe one of them didn't show up until 1974.
Oh, yeah.
And when asked why he hung out, yeah. They asked him at first, why'd you hang out over there? He's like, I knew we had lost, but I figured whenever Japan counterattacked or the Empire rose again, I'd be there to help when they got there.
So he wanted to be the reverse George Tweed.
Yeah. In the case of Guam, I mean, Guam becomes a tourist fed. So even though the island is declared secured, there is still capturing Japanese and light fighting throughout 1944. It has to do with the terrain, but also because the Marines were attacking so aggressively, they were bypassing pockets of Japanese.
So that is interesting, though, you brought up that there is a Japanese survivor who actually knew the war was over, but he decided to keep going anyway. Because I feel like with most of the ones you hear about, they hadn't heard news, or they thought the news they heard was enemy propaganda.
Yeah, some of that. I think in the case of him, I think either he believed just the battle was lost. That eventually, the Navy would rally, counterattack, and return to Guam.
Right.
Yeah. So, the Marianas are important for a number of reasons. One, this is penetrating Japan's inner defensive ring. So, in early 1943, Tojo, as part of his power play, essentially said that no, we're going to defend New Britain, Solomons, and they placed the Marshalls and the Gilbert Islands outside this defensive ring. Americans penetrate past that, and now they penetrate the inner defensive ring. And this is where the B-29 is going to come in, because while the Air Force tended to send their latest equipment to Europe first, not in the case of the B-29, the most advanced bomber of World War II, because it's got the range to hit Japan. And it's going to have the range from the Marianas. The Marianas are there to be developed as naval bases, but more importantly, air bases from which to bomb the Japanese homelands, which it's going to take a few months for it to happen. In the first raids of 1944, are not that effective because of the amount of aircraft being used and also the way they're being utilized. But still, uh, Japan is now under bomber threat, and the inner defensive ring has been penetrated. Now, Tojo had a lot of problems. Emperor Hirohito had been increasingly felt increasingly didn't like him. And keep in mind too, the fall of Attu and Kiska uh, really affected Hirohito, and he went into seclusion a lot of 1943. So, so there's a lot of attacks on Tojo, especially from the imperial family. And while Tojo did not have as much power as Hitler, Mussolini, or Stalin, and arguably Churchill, he has a lot of power. Oh, by the way, but he seemed to have been accruing more and more power. So, by the way, was in addition to being prime minister, he removed the chief of staff of the army, so he's that as well. And then get this, he's minister of education.
Damn.
Yeah, and I want to say, yeah, minister of munitions as well. Now, a lot of people are saying like Tojo's getting too much power, or how can one guy run all these things? Being fair to Tojo, he was a relentless worker.
So you think do you think in the back of his mind he was thinking of himself as kind of like the new shogun? Because like the shogun's kind of like the emperor's handler from the feudal period.
Yes, yes, in a way, but also would never subscribe to the idea that he was going to create a true military dictatorship. I think it's a bit more like what Hindenburg and Ludendorff were doing. Like I'm gonna run the show until the war's over, and I'll give you back more power afterwards. You know, so so to essentially there's a rising peace faction with the Japanese, and there's also a feeling that Tojo had relegated people like Yamashita and some other talented commanders simply because they didn't like these guys. They're from rival factions. So to appease these people, Tojo decides that he's going to get rid of the Navy minister, Shimada. Shimada and Tojo were genuinely very close, but Tojo had been playing a little game where he had blamed Shimada for a lot of the defeats that were happening, and sorry, so he did that in 1943. Well, not so much Shimada. I'm sorry, no, not Shimada. It was the army commander, Sugumiya, the one he replaces. Sugiyama. He's the one he replaces in early 1944. He was blaming a lot of the defeats on him, and that's partially to get rid of the guy. So it's power play. Shimada is his friend and ally, but Shimada, in many ways, was hated by the Navy because he was seen as simply being like Tojo's. Oh God, what they call him? They call him Tojo's tea servant.
Yeah, and I think tea servants usually have the connotation of being like borderline prostitutes in Japan, by the way.
Yeah, I think so as well. So, but that being said, Shimada and Tojo were genuinely friends, and when Shimada was forced out, and he went to Tojo to do it to tell him that he was resigning and leaving, Tojo cried. That was his friend and ally. But Tojo also believed that getting rid of his friend and ally is how he could keep power. It's not enough. So Tojo is out. And now you're going to get the... Oh man, I can't pronounce this one. Koizu cabinet. Koizu is... I'm going to say... Koizu is part of that peace faction. His idea is to have a separate peace with China. And the thing is, he's going this middle way, so he can't really satisfy hawks or doves. Now, keeping in mind, Tojo, of course, was a hawk, but so was Sugiyama, the commander of the army, the head army chief of staff that he replaced in early 1944. While he does represent the peace faction, it's probably more appropriate to say he's a bit more of a neutral part, a middle way, you know?
Right. So he's more of a
This cabinet is, yeah, and that's the thing with the Japanese. They're talking about peace, but they can't quite settle on a way how to do it, and they're also trying to do it in a way that we would never allow. Now, like you're not going to get a separate peace with China, not after the kind of campaign that you've waged. You know. Um, at any rate, though, so the Japanese government is in turmoil. Tojo, despite his weaknesses, they have lost a man um, who does actually have a decent strategic vision and is an extremely hard worker. And but at the same time, the Japanese have realized that it's probably best in these islands to hold out for as long as possible. And that was also going on in Bayak to a lesser degree. That battle was ongoing during this. That was a particularly fierce battle. I mentioned it a bit earlier. And then you're going to get into one of the worst battles of the entirety of World War II, which would be the battle in the Palau chain, mostly for the island of Pelew. Do you know much about this one?
I mean, I know it's notorious for being brutal, but other than that, I don't know any details.
So the battle, I'm going to say Palau too, just because it's easier to say. So battle for Palau. Uh,
Oh yeah,
this is
Peleliu.
one of the most. What'd you say?
Yeah, I guess
Pelew?
Palau and Peleliu, right?
Peleliu is the island in Palau. I'm just going to say Palau.
Okay, fair enough.
Operation to secure Palau is an example of some truly atrocious planning on our part. Now, some of this is because by this time the debate is, do we go to the Philippines or not? Now, Ernest J. King says bypass it. We can go to Formosa. Nimitz favors that. MacArthur says no. You must return to the Philippines. All right. And MacArthur's arguments essentially are that we had troops stationed there. We suffered this terrible defeat. Japanese propaganda was always about, we're freeing you all from the imperialists. I mean, we got to occupy you for now to win this war. But after that, we're going to be in the Southeast Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Right.
Now, the way Japanese occupation would work would depend on the area. For instance, significant portions of Indonesia and Burma were collaborationists with the Japanese, some of whom would then become important players in the political game in both countries afterwards. This is not the case in the Philippines. The Japanese truly just treat the Philippines as a place they garrison. Local populace despises them. I did not realize I knew there was a Filipino resistance. I didn't realize how well organized and large it was and how important it was. It was the Philippine resistance that captured the documents when Admiral Koga's plane went down, that showed the Japanese counterattack plans.
Well, I know that
They are
U.S.
launching attacks
submarines
on
were for years supplying the rebels in the Philippines with weapons and ammo and stuff.
Yeah. At some point, I think there was the Filipino resistance ballooned at one point to 200,000 fighters at one point. And yeah, so this constant fight, especially in 1944, you're right, the submarines are laying stuff. So MacArthur's saying that, these people are being oppressed by the Japanese. This was not technically a territory, but weren't they like semi-autonomous, right? And so we need to go back in there. We need to prove the Japanese propaganda is wrong. Roosevelt is convinced, and actually so is Nimitz. And in addition to that, there is some indications that to attack Formosa in the first place, you would probably need more shipping than you would to start your attack in the Philippines. And furthermore, that you would probably have to attack Luzon anyway to get air bases.
Right. So
And there was an attempt, I think, so you're going to go to the Philippines anyway. And then the other argument is that if you're attacking Luzon, well, you don't really have a support base nearby either. So you have to work your way from the south of the Philippines. And MacArthur also made the valid argument that when you secure the Philippines, you do cut the supply route from the oil and resources of Southwest Asia and the Southwest Pacific from Japan. So for all these reasons, it's agreed upon to attack the Philippines. They decide they're going to go for the island of Leyte. Some people said they should have got it from Mindanao, which is the southern island, but Leyte they decided to go for because they know Leyte has not been fortified. They believe Leyte will make for a good air base, and the idea is that they could thereby split the Japanese off. So you take Leyte, it's like busting the center of the line. Mindanao and everything below it is then immediately cut off, where it's going to be very difficult to resupply them, and Leyte can be secured quickly. And I think they're right about that. And also, Leyte Gulf would be good anchorage. It's a good spot to attack. So there are a lot of good reasons for going for Leyte instead of Mindanao first. That being said, you're going to need some bases nearby. So they developed Mortai Island into a base. That battle, by the way, they land there. There's only like 500 Japanese, so that's not much of a battle. The other one, though, is going to be Palau. The idea is you need to secure Palau, both to make sure the Japanese can't launch air attacks from Palau, and also to get an air base closer to Leyte. Now, the man who is opposed to this operation is Halsey. Halsey says the terrain there is rough. We can just isolate the island. We don't need to worry about it. The Americans, though, completely underestimate the Japanese defenses. Get this. They believe they were going to take the island in 5 days. They were going to take Paleau in 5 days.
And then ended up taking over a month, or
the fighting's going to go on for the main fighting will go on for over a month. But even then, the Paleau became notorious for how many Japanese held out all the way to the end of the war. The actual last formal surrender, by some accounts, is on Paleau when one of the Japanese commanders surrenders his unit in like 1947.
shit.
I say his unit. I don't mean like a regiment here. I'm talking about, him and like maybe 20 guys or something, right? But there was a unit of men with an officer, and apparently they were still attacking people. So the island would have had that sporadic light fighting until the end of the war and beyond. So the Japanese at the same time are preparing extensive defenses. The island is reinforced, and they are specifically said no banzai attacks. None. You are there to hold out and fight for as long as possible. Now, the commander at Palau is the commander of the Naval Bombardment Forces, Jesse Oldendorf, who will play a big part in Leyte Gulf and winning the Battle of Surigao Strait. If I say winning the Battle of Surigao Strait, I mean your grandma could have won that one. But Surigao Strait is a little controversial, but we'll get into that whenever I do the Leyte Gulf stream. So what happens is Oldendorf actually does a short bombardment. And so the Japanese do launch counterattacks throughout the battle, but they're not banzai charges, right? They're well coordinated attacks, including the use of tanks, which that's a really good scene in the Pacific when you get there. Besides the hardcore Japanese resistance, there was a considerable heat wave, temperatures well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And I found out this horrifying thing. Water was scarce, and they were bringing the water up to the Marines in fuel cans that were not properly cleaned.
God damn.
Yeah, the result is not only does the water taste absolutely horrible, but by one estimate, something like maybe as many as 1,000 Marines are taken out just from drinking fuel can water. Definitely hundreds for sure.
Taken out as incapacitated or killed?
Incapacitated. It might have killed one. It might have killed a handful, but no, it's like you got to go back to the hospital. You can't be at the front right now. So this is a hellish battle. Also, the first Marines are in this one. Now they'd fought at Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is no cakewalk, but at the same time, losses at Guadalcanal were relatively minor, right? Within a few days at Palau, the first Marines lose as many men as they lost at Guadalcanal in the whole, months-long battle. Veterans are dropping like flies, especially in the First Marines, which First Marines being the First Marine Regiment, which was led by Chesty Puller, suffered horrendous casualties. They're going up to reporters and saying Guadalcanal was nothing like this. So the First Marine is completely shocked by what's going on.
Man.
So yeah, oh yeah, there's oh god, there's 81st Division comes in. One of the Marine commanders, I think the commander of the First Marine Division, by the way, I think his name is Rupertus. This is his only battle. He was heavily criticized for his tactics.
Mm.
So this is one of the worst battles of the entirety of World War II. Our losses in the Palau campaign are nearly equal to Japan's losses. Now, Saipan had gotten a little close to that, but this really is the first time where it gets close to that. Um, and in many ways, I would argue that this is a real turning point in the Pacific. Uh, that doesn't mean we're not going to still have battles where you inflict heavier losses, like you'll see at Leyte. It just means that the the days of the island campaigns where you would just blast the Japanese and then they would do these bonsai charges, those days are diminishing. And Palau is this is Iwo Jima before Iwo Jima in a lot of ways. So absolutely horrible battle. And here is what the it's also Iwo Jima in that there is a lot of debate today to was there even a reason to go there? Was Halsey right in the end? Because Palau did not provide that good of an air base to support Leyte. Mortai was the more important base. The Japanese were not going to be able to operate a bunch of aircraft out of Palau and attack convoys. It just wasn't possible. I would argue this battle was not needed. Halsey was right. I will say it did give one benefit, though. The units involved in this battle would then be at Okinawa, and they did much better than the other units at Okinawa because they when they get to Okinawa, they're experiencing the Japanese using the same type of tactics. So the First Marines will excel at Okinawa, for instance. And there's an argument made that Okinawa, of course, is a big, brutal battle, but unlike Palau and Iwo Jima, our losses do not approach Japanese losses, although it is still a big, brutal battle. So the argument you can make is that the units involved got their first taste of this kind of warfare in a battle that was less important than Okinawa and will help us out in winning that one eventually. But still, this battle probably didn't need to happen. You know, any thoughts on Palau there?
So I guess in some ways this was almost the low point of Marine landings then.
It's pretty bad. I mean, Tar was bad as well because there was a lot of things. You know, the bombardment was too short. They didn't have enough LVTs to get over the reefs. You know, but Tarwa was horrible but very short. It only lasted a few days. You know, but this one just went meat grinder that goes on and on. And remember, it's supposed to be wrapped up in what 5 days. This isn't bad planning here.
And who was the primary planner?
So yeah, it's a
of
pretty
this?
bad one.
Was this a MacArthur
Oh,
operation?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head right now. Well, the thing about the operation is it's a little thrown together, though. To be fair.
Oh, because they didn't really think anything
let me
would
see.
go wrong.
Well, remember, MacArthur's concentrating on
The Philippines.
the Philippines.
Because he
Yeah,
always
exactly.
promised he would return, so... He dramatically
Hey, you know,
declared, I shall
you know,
return.
Like I said, that 1944, this is MacArthur's best year as a commander. He's right. MacArthur's correct about going to the Philippines for all the reasons that I said earlier. But I don't think he was that involved in the planning for this attack. So wait 1 second. Let me see something. Well, I guess Nimitz would have done it. Halsey did provide the air support, but keeping in mind too, once again, this is really more about getting ready for the Philippines. That leads to the Battle of Formosa. You know much about that one?
I don't. I never actually knew the U.S. went to Formosa.
We don't land on Formosa, okay? The Battle of Formosa is us attacking the Japanese at Formosa because we want to sink a bunch of their ships. Because remember, Formosa, today's Taiwan, is the base from which they attack the Philippines. It's where their shipping goes through to Japan. And the idea was you attack it, you sink a bunch of ships, you damage the area as a base. That helps when you do strike the Philippines. And you destroy all the land-based aircraft that's in the area. And this leads to what Halsey referred to as a knockdown, drag-out fight between, uh, land-based air and carrier aircraft. The Japanese do damage a few ships, but they do not inflict a decisive defeat by any means. They will lose a lot of airplanes. However, here's where it gets funny. The Japanese, though, are going to report that they have sunk a lot of ships, to the point where there's actually victory parades in Japan.
Damn.
And this actually briefly brings the emperor out of a funk, and the Japanese now not everybody of course believes this, right? But a lot of the Japanese, some of the Japanese naval command starts to think, wait, if we can like actually win that decisive battle, we might be able to pull this off. At least that's what I've heard. There's other arguments to say that wasn't the case. I'll tell you when I get there, okay? But yeah, the Japanese damaged a few ships, but they didn't sink what they claimed to have sunk. And I'm not finding the exact claims right now, but they were claiming something like 7 aircraft carriers were sunk.
How many U.S. aircraft carriers were there?
Oh, at this point, whew, man, quite a few. We're churning them out left and right. Now, the leftover from the old days is Enterprise and Saratoga, because Hornet, Yorktown, Wasp, and Lexington are all on the bottom. And Ranger, you're never bringing Ranger out, because you know a bunch about the aircraft carrier Ranger. Well, it wasn't very good, right?
I know you told me it wasn't
the
very good.
Yeah, Ranger was used in the Atlantic, where it did just fine. It was used in the Atlantic theater, where it did just fine. That's where it needed to be. Yeah, I mean, Ranger was considered to be such a bad carrier that there was rarely ever a serious thought of, hey, let's bring Ranger to the Pacific. And keeping in mind, Wasp wasn't considered to be that good either, but Wasp was considered to be just a little bit better, so we did bring Wasp in, but Wasp did not have a very long career. Anyway, though, we're just churning out Essex carriers. We also had the Independence class carriers, which is a kind of interesting one. That was Roosevelt's brainchild. Now, fun thing about Franklin Roosevelt is that he had done defense cuts throughout the 1930s, but he made sure the Navy was always not cut so much. Because remember, he was Undersecretary of the Navy.
Right, back
and
in
when he was having
Wilson
discussions
years.
with when he was having discussions with the Army and Navy people around, Franklin Roosevelt would refer to us, as in him and his Navy people, against them, the Army. So Franklin Roosevelt did intervene and said that he wanted that the carrier losses had been so heavy they needed to churn out some carriers. So he pushed for the Independence class. All the Independence class carriers was you take the hull of these Cleveland class light cruisers, and then you just convert them into carriers. There are some people who didn't really like this one too much, because the Independence class carriers themselves, one of them sank in the war. Luckily, I say luckily because these things were not particularly well protected. If they'd gone against the old Kido Butai of 1942, I think a lot more of them would have been at the bottom. All right, so, but for a light carrier, they are fast and they can carry a fair amount of aircraft, like up to 30, I believe. So, as far as light carriers go, they're decent. But there's a reason why the light carrier idea didn't get past World War II by much, except for helicopter carriers, which is different. Fun fact about the Independence class: the last one was the USS Cabot, which was actually in the Spanish Navy until the 1980s. Then they brought it to New Orleans to try to preserve it as a museum ship. We failed everybody, but this is 1990s New Orleans when we are at the pit of incompetence. And the D-Day Museum was opened, and they were making some moves to try to save the ship, but they didn't. And I also kind of feel like, people were just so D-Day obsessed anyway at the time because of Saving Private Ryan. The D-Day Museum is now today the National World War II Museum. And so I don't think they preserved anything from the Cabot, because they scrapped the Cabot, and there was an effort to try to save the island on the ship and maybe have that brought over to New Orleans for the museum. They didn't succeed at that either. I would love for somebody who works the museum at that time, I'd love to talk to somebody from that period just to say, like, hey, what happened to the Cabot, and why'd you not get this ship, or even parts of this ship, for the museum? It just seems like such a monumental screw-up. But
What ended up
but
happening
for years, though, It's gone, scrapped.
Oh fuck.
Yeah, but throughout the 1990s, when I lived on the West Bank, you could see the Cabot on the other side of the river. So we just had a light, World War II aircraft carrier just chilling on the Mississippi River for a few years. But anyway, so he pushed the independence classes, so you have a number of those. I'll tell you what. I'm on the one of the greatest websites ever, which is the Pacific Theater Encyclopedia. You ever read this thing?
I haven't.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, he's got an article on almost everything. The articles are usually not particularly long. One of the things I like is he loves snark. He's very snarky, and he loves talking about backbiting between officers. Uh, but in the case of the Essex, you're going to have. All right, I'll just read them off for you. Uh, Essex, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Lexington, Intrepid. I've been on board that one. That one's in New York. Very much recommend going to that one if you're in the area. Wasp, Hornet. That's right. They made, the ones that got sunk got new versions. Franklin, which Hancock, Ticonderoga, Bennington, Randolph, Shangri-La, Antietam, and Bonhomme Richard, which is reference to Bonhomme Richard is reference to John Paul Jones' ship in the American Revolution, not the Led Zeppelin guitarist. I'm a
Right.
bassist. At that time, now some of these might be being out. That might be doing a refit, but Halsey should have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. He should have 8 carriers, Essex class carriers. Now let me check out the Independence real quick. For the Independence, you have Independence, Belle Wood, Princeton. That's the one that sinks. Cowpens, Monterey, Cabot, Langley, Bataan, San Jacinto. Oh, they're all deployed by that time. So then he would have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, I'm sorry, 1, 3, 6, 7. Yeah, like 10 of these things. It looks like.
So
or is
even
it 9? Yeah,
so
it's 9.
even
Sorry,
if,
9.
So even if the
9.
Japanese estimates had been right and they had taken out 7 carriers, I mean that would have been a horrific loss of life, but it actually wouldn't have actually changed much strategically.
Uh, I would have changed things strategically. It would have delayed things. Because let's say they've sank like 7 carriers, right? Um, let's say they sink 7 carriers. There's no way we're going to attack Leyte Gulf. We're not going to attack Leyte. You know, let alone the chances of winning Leyte Gulf are much diminished as well. Now there are a number of the what they call escort carriers that are also coming out, also known as jeep carriers. We lost a number of these during the Pacific War. Those though are those carriers. They're not particularly fast. The whole point of them was originally convoy protection, still used for convoy protection, but also close support for your landings. So you're calling an airstrike on Leyte, you're getting support from an escort carrier, most likely.
Right.
Those carriers, by the way, were still rocking Wildcats.
Really?
Those are not fleet carriers. Like the Independence class and the Essex, those are fast carriers. They carry larger air wings. Well, Independence not by much, but still, it's a fast ship. So, anyways, even if the Japanese inflicted some heavy losses, yeah, I mean, what more can they? It's going to delay us, no doubt about that. It's bad for us, but strategically, it's just delaying the inevitable because we are churning out Essex class carriers. Although I think Antietam. I want to see. I'm going to look that up real quick about Antietam. I'm curious if because Pacific War Encyclopedia doesn't have that handy. I just want to see real quick if Antietam and Bonhomme Richard saw any real action. Because I think Bonhomme Richard did, but I actually to be honest, man, I didn't even know we had a Essex class carrier called Antietam.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. I've also never heard of Bonhomme Richard for World War II.
Yeah, I heard of that one just because it's like just a because the name on that one is just it's just a throwback to the Navy's glory days, right?
Right.
So let me see. Also, there was typically a tendency to avoid naming aircraft carriers or anything really after Civil War battles. simply because Antietam. Probably the reason they chose Antietam is because it's, well, especially at that time, was just thought of as a draw,
Yeah.
right? I mean, so yeah, it's like you don't name one Vicksburg, right, or Gettysburg. You're like, no, you know. Keeping in mind, the reconciliation narrative is still all the rage. So let me see. All right, Shakedown Cruise and all the West. Nope. Antietam had left Pearl Harbor, and then heard the war was over, like 3 days in.
Man.
Yeah. So it was. They'd done their shakedown cruise. They were about to be sent out there, and it just didn't happen.
So I guess if they had it, let's say if they had decided to land in Japan mainland and not drop the bomb, then maybe it would have supported those landings.
Oh, most certainly, it was on the way. And God, they had like saying like, man, they had a lot of these carriers planned. Anyway, fun fact about the Essex class, they continued after the war, and a lot of them were serving into the 1960s and 70s, typically as helicopter carriers. It was really only in the 1970s they started decommissioning these things in large numbers. Jim Morrison's dad, who was an admiral in the Navy, was a commander of one of these.
Oh wow.
Yeah, but in Nam, you know. Oh yeah, I remember. Yeah, that's right. I remember mentioning that to you. He was the admiral at the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Right.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. That's a crazy coincidence there. Anyway, so what am I getting to on this one? So
Especially since his
that'll
son's music would become so iconic as part of the anti-war movement.
Yeah, although Jim Morrison really didn't do the Doors really didn't do too many particular topical songs in that regard. And even when they would do things like they did the song "Unknown Soldier," which is on the third album, and that can be seen as a Vietnam protest song, but it's also fairly generalized also, you know. So unlike some where you get that are very specific, like Country Joe and the Fish. But anyways, all right. So um, the Japanese believe they've inflicted these horrific losses on us to the point actually where they dispatched a small fleet of cruisers and destroyers in the area, which led by Admiral Shima, to actually mop up what the damage they had done. But Shima pulled out. Shima's an interesting admiral, by the way. He he wasn't he was he early in the war he was involved in the Battle of Coral Sea and took Tulugai, which is the island just north of Guadalcanal. Uh, you don't really hear too much about him, and then in 1944 he shows up, and Shima was Shima's force was part of Leyte Gulf, and he was heavily criticized by a lot of Americans. I think one of which called him like a clown or a buffoon, and Shima was angry about this. And there's a fun thing from a 1952 issue of Time. They had this little article where a kid who was writing about Leyte Gulf wrote to Shima to ask him questions about what he was doing, and Shima wrote the kid back in America.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I thought he was just doing this for like some high school report or something, and he wrote the admiral randomly, and the admiral wrote him right back.
Damn.
So Shima's an interesting guy.
So Shima must have
Interesting
also
person.
known English then.
Yes, at Shima, or he had a good translator. In the case of Shima, I mention that because Shima very quickly understood. Wait a second, I don't think they've inflicted that many losses. So he pulls his fleet back before they can get ambushed or attacked. So smart for him. He's going to kind of do the same thing at Leyte Gulf as well. Yeah. So, anyways, I was going to say, yeah. So the Japanese overstate that. So they don't know where the Americans are going to strike next. Because remember, Japanese intelligence relied on agents, not code breaking so much. Remember, they every time they think, hey, did they break our codes? They go, nah, not really. So the Japanese have several contingency plans set up for the fleet to launch a grand counterattack wherever the Americans may go. And that will get into the Battle of Leyte. Let me go grab a cup of water here. All right, so with the fall of Tojo, Yamashita is put in command in the Philippines. He is not the overall commander of the theater. That is Teruyuchi, who... Teruyuchi was interesting. He was a bit of a hidebound officer. He at first doubted the wisdom of fighting a decisive battle in the Philippines, but then decided that was the place to do it, which was Leyte. All right. The commander at Leyte is named at Leyte itself is Suzuki. Suzuki, by the way, is really confident they're going to win this battle. Now, I know I say that, what journalists go into a battle not feeling confident, but that happens all the time. We're going to see that with the Japanese invasion of India. A lot of the generals who were the division commanders, none of them thought they could work. Right? This guy really does think that he is going to be able to destroy them. All right? So, massive attack launched at Leyte. This is an all-army operation, by the way. No marine units involved. This precipitates the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the Japanese launch 4 fleets and attempt to destroy the landing transports. Like I said, we're going to do a whole stream on that sometime, but just a general outline of the battle. Ozawa is ordered to decoy the Americans. The reason he's going to be able to decoy the Americans is a few reasons. One, Nimitz supported that Spruance did not go after the Japanese fleet at Philippine Sea. But on the down low, this can be seen as a criticism. He explicitly told Halsey, if you see the Japanese fleet, engage them, especially the carriers. Now, we know that they inflicted a lot of losses on the Japanese carriers, but we knew that the Japanese still had a number of carriers. Right? So you still had the Zuikaku, which is I think that's their remaining fleet carrier. They're building the Unryus, but that class wasn't really ready. They had a number of light carriers, so our thinking was the Japanese still had a potent carrier force out there that might be able to inflict losses if we're not careful. So Nimitz specifically told Halsey, they show up, you fight them. At the same time, Halsey not only wants to fight the Japanese, because keep in mind, what's interesting about Halsey is we think of this as carrier commander. He never commanded in a true carrier battle. He was supposed to go to Midway, but he had a skin disorder brought on by stress and overwork, so he wasn't at Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons. By Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz Islands, he was theater commander. He wasn't carrier commander. So Halsey's thinking he wants to be in a carrier fight. He wants to join up with the Fletcher Spruance Club.
Right.
And Halsey was also secretly hoping to overtake the Japanese fleet and fight a surface action. So he has that going on. So he has orders from Nimitz and his own inclinations. So Halsey will fall for the bait. Now, the main Japanese battleship force takes considerable losses. 2 of their heavy cruisers, Atago and Maya, are sunk by submarines. And then the Musashi is sunk by Halsey's carrier aircraft. By the way, of course, Halsey did lose the light carrier Princeton to a Japanese attack earlier. So the Japanese do get scratch 1 flat top. At the same time, Nishimura commands the force that's supposed to go up the Sarigao Strait. I want to look into this some more, but it's been argued that Nishimura was actually there as a decoy, meant to make the Americans commit in the wrong direction and expend their ammunition. Because keep this in mind, those battleships in Leyte Gulf, those American battleships, most of their shells are going to be for the beaches.
Right.
And in fighting Sarigao Strait, Oldendorf expended almost all of his armor-piercing rounds. I'll look more into it, everybody, but that's what I read in the book, Battle of Sarigao Strait. I think that explains Nishimura's actions. Because, fun thing about Nishimura, his last message to Kurita, the commander of the center, the main strike force, was mission accomplished. That was his last message. And then Shima's fleet was going to back up Nishimura's fleet, but the coordination between the two was poor. I want to look more into that one as well, because there's been some arguments that Nishimura sailed rapidly ahead because Shima outranked him. The two guys didn't like each other. I don't know. Let me look into it. Point is, Shima arrives, sees that the Americans have already diced up Nishimura's force, and he turns back, although not before taking his own losses. At any rate, though, Kurita swings south with his center force. He runs into those American escort carriers. Battle off Samar, which is considered American Navy's greatest moment in World War II, where destroyers and destroyer escorts go headlong and attack the main Japanese battle fleet, while the aircraft are also constantly attacking as well. Even though they don't have the ordnance to sink that many. And even though they don't have as much anti-shipping ordnance, I think in some cases they're even dropping depth charges on the Japanese battleships, but they fend them off. And while the Americans lose one of the escort carriers, I want to say 3 destroyers, the Japanese lose 3 heavy cruisers and turn back fleet. One thing is for sure, Kurita was definitely not the right man for that mission, because he was not a Japanese officer who believed in needlessly sacrificing. Like, this is a guy who does not like kamikazes, for instance. Right. And he was made head of the Naval Academy after this, and he loved this job apparently because he saw it as him training Japan's next cadre of leaders for when the nightmare of the war was over. So anyway, though, Leyte Gulf is major American victory. The Japanese Navy is no longer a major factor in our plans, although their aircraft are going to be, because it's around this time that they start making the first kamikaze attacks, which sink several ships. So that's Leyte Gulf in a nutshell. Oh, forgot to mention, the big controversy of the Americans is the fact that Halsey did turn away and chased after Ozawa's force. Technically, Halsey got his wish. Ozawa attacked him with some carrier aircraft. Halsey attacked him back, but almost nobody really thinks of it as a true carrier battle. And because the Japanese didn't even have enough pilots to fill their flight decks, to fill the carriers up. They only had I think 100 airplanes between Shikaku and the other 3 carriers, Zuho, Chiyoda, and Shitaus. Yeah. So anyways, they didn't even have 100 aircraft between those 4, and those 4 combined can carry more than 100. Anyway, though, so terrible losses for the Japanese again. There actually is some surface battles, nothing more like shooting cripples, but still, Halsey gets his wish. It's just not all that grand, and he took the bait. This meant a lot of people were very angry with Halsey after that. It should also be kept in mind, too, that Halsey was part of a different command. For Leyte landings to happen, Nimitz had to loan MacArthur some troops. MacArthur has the naval component in his command, which is led by Admiral Kincaid. Halsey's carriers are technically under Nimitz, and Nimitz was still giving them guidance. And the ability for Halsey and Kincaid to coordinate was not properly laid out as well. So actually, when Halsey went to go chase Ozawa, he apparently didn't really tell Kincaid.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. What's that in the background? That's loud.
What's what?
What was that? Oh, must have been me, maybe. Yeah, never mind. Sorry. I flipped a page. I didn't realize it was that loud. Sorry. Oh. So anyways, yeah, my bad. Anyways, so where was I? Yeah. So the Japanese lose heavily, but there's been a lot of criticism of Halsey ever since. That leads to that joke line in Hunt for Red October between Alec Baldwin and Marco Ramius. Jack Ryan, right? And he's like, he says that he wrote a book on Admiral Halsey, and what does he say? He says, "I've read this book, and your conclusions were all wrong. Halsey acted stupidly."
Oh. Oh, I don't.
So there you go, man. Marco Ramius is not a Halsey fan, all right?
He must be more of a Fletcher guy.
Yeah, he might be, or Spruance. What's really going? This is a big one to say. What really is going to anger me about Halsey is that when there's a certain point where he a few after Leyte Gulf, he sailed his fleet right into the middle of a typhoon. Which,
yes.
I think it's called Typhoon Cobra. Yeah, and it was 4 destroyers with lots of other ones damaged. Drachenfeld has a great video on this one.
Yeah, I was going to say, Halsey's the only admiral to take on a typhoon, so he can claim to be the only admiral to fight Poseidon.
To fight Poseidon? Wait, didn't Caligula say he fought Poseidon or something?
I wouldn't be surprised if he said something like that. I know famously Xerxes, when he was trying to cross the Bosporus, the boat bridge he's trying to build, the tide was a little rough, so then it worked, so he got pissed off and he had somebody whip the water into submission. So they literally were whipping the water, and then they tried again and the bridge went up. So I guess he did defeat Poseidon.
Doesn't Herodotus relate that story?
He does, yeah.
Yeah. That's funny, man.
Yeah, it's one of the better stories about the Persians being crazy.
So, what was I going to say? No, so yeah, so Halsey, a lot of controversy with his command at this time. Um, Leyte Gulf it's in the end it's a victory. The Japanese lose what? Three battleships, one fleet carrier, three light carriers. I want to say nine cruisers, 10 destroyers. Pretty bad. Um, but at least unlike Philippine Sea, they get some licks in, right? So this Philippine Sea, I mean, that's got to be the Japanese Navy's worst
Right.
defeat in a major battle of the war. At least
Which
the one
was
that's most one-sided.
which was the battle where the Japanese fleet was running so low on fuel that Tokyo basically ordered them like, yeah, just do something with the fleet before we run out of gas completely. Was that Leyte Gulf?
In a way, yes, because one of the things they said is we're going to commit the entire fleet because if the Philippines fall, we're cut off from our gas anyway. So make your move now. Oh, it should be noted too, a lot of the gasoline they were using was not refined in some cases or only partially refined. So one of the reasons they think that some of the loss of Leyte Gulf for Japan were bad was their fuel was particularly volatile.
Oh,
Yeah, well, the fleet is essentially hanging out where the oil rigs are. Well, not the oil rigs, but where the oil platforms are, like in Brunei
man.
or Borneo. Yeah, So, anyways, so what was I going to say? Yeah. So, Japanese fleet is no longer a factor. They're out. Now, I say no longer a factor. The Japanese fleet now relegates itself to transport duties, and this is an important thing about Leyte is because of Leyte is actually not as good for an airbase, and because of the weather, putting up an airbase on Leyte itself is delayed. Halsey's fleet can't hang out there forever. They got to go back to eventually provision. One of the ways they actually did keep things going is that some of the carriers, what remaining provisions they had, or any ammunition they have, would be put on a few carriers while the rest of them went back. Right. This means that Leyte is one of the only battles at this time where the Japanese actually can do air attacks. So they're bombing American positions for once. At the same time, the Japanese Navy is able to run supplies to Leyte like it's Guadalcanal again. That's at Ormoc Bay. But there is limits to that. One of those convoys actually get ambushed, and they sank like four Japanese destroyers, including the Shimakaza, which was famous for being able to hit 40 knots. Fast destroyer. So, anyways, what's that noise? I hear like it almost sounds like an eraser or something.
I don't know, man.
I don't hear it. There's nothing over here moving.
Oh,
Okay, so, anyways, so the Japanese are able to run supplies in because we don't have air superiority for a number of weeks, and they're able to actually make air attacks on the island of Leyte. Okay, now this is to a limited extent, and eventually the airfields are put into action. Okay. And the Japanese fleet, by the way, there is the surviving warships after gassing up then go north. This time, though, U.S. subs are all over the Formosa area. So between Philippines, Formosa, and the Japanese home islands, there's just submarines everywhere. And so the Japanese suffer a series of cataclysmic losses. One of them is the battleship Congo, which was sunk off the coast of Formosa. And then the carrier Onryu and Shinano, both of these were brand spanking new carriers. Shinano, by the way, is the biggest aircraft carrier of World War II in terms of tonnage. Sometimes called the first supercarrier. Both of them are sunk by submarines with catastrophic loss of life, and both of them are sunk doing cargo. So for a period of time, the Japanese Navy was like, okay, well, we're just a fleet that guards transports too, and transports things like like using aircraft carriers to transport things. After this, they're like, we can't even do that effectively. So even after Leyte Gulf, they still are suffering heavy losses, although this time it's almost exclusively, well, not almost exclusively, it's between submarines and carrier raids in the Philippines.
right.
Which led to a fun one. The one mention real quick is the heavy cruiser Kamano. Halsey himself, who notoriously hated the Japanese, once said, if there was any one ship in the Japanese Navy I felt bad for, it was the Kumano, because that thing took a lot to sink, a lot of punishment before it finally went down. So what's left of the Japanese Navy is doing transport duty and still suffers heavy losses. So by 19, and of course they're gradually running out of gas. So by 1945, the Japanese Navy is relegated to performing anti-aircraft defense. Like you're essentially their anti-aircraft gun platforms to fight off air attacks, pretty much. And they'll be the last cruise, the Amato, but we'll go over that one in the part three stream. Anyways, the Battle of Leyte. What's interesting is that there's like for the Japanese a lot of debate. So Suzuki is confident that he can win in Leyte. Terauchi believes that's where the decisive land battle should be fought to determine the war. Yamashita goes, no, we shouldn't be doing this. And by the way, do you think, real quick here, do you think Yamashita believed the Navy's reports about Formosa or didn't believe them? What do you think?
I'm going to guess that he did not because of the Army-Navy rivalry.
No, he straight up said to them, if you inflicted that many losses, they wouldn't be landing in Leyte in the first place. Also, why are their carrier aircraft attacking the Philippines right now? And so Yamashita very quickly goes, guys, you did not inflict that many losses on the Formosa, if anything. Because Yamashita, remember, he's usually right. So, oh, by the way, I do have a total for you for Leyte Gulf. I did find the total. The total number of aircraft carriers of all types at Leyte Gulf for the Americans are 32.
Holy shit.
32 of all types.
Man.
Right?
So the air was full of American aircraft the whole time then?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The Japanese are lucky their whole fleet wasn't destroyed.
And you could, hey, Colonel Marco Ramius, that's because Halsey acted stupidly.
Yeah, man. That's,
okay, yeah.
I guess you're right in general, though. By 1944, the Japanese fleet was just way too outgunned to have any real shot.
They would need to have had something where they attacked, like, say, what I said, which is maybe if they hit us at Bayak, they could have, caused some havoc there, because they would have outnumbered the Americans at that one area, then destroyed the transports. So the Japanese Navy had any chance, it was going to be to pick off one of these an American subsidiary landing. We just didn't do that many. Typically, the Marianas, even Palau, when we're going there, and then of course Leyte Gulf. You concentrate as much of your fleet assets in one place as possible. So if we were doing, it's kind of like this. Think about this. Think about it like almost like Coral Sea in a way. The Japanese throughout 1942, they're doing these subsidiary attacks all over the place, right? And one of the reasons we're able to win Coral Sea is because the Japanese launched a major offensive in that area and only committed 2 fleet carriers and 1 light carrier. Technically, they should have been able to have 6 fleet carriers. Do you think if Fletcher showed up with Lexington and Yorktown and he ran into the entire 6-carrier fleet, do you think what would have happened there? But we're not doing that. Wherever we're going, except with the exception of Bayak, really, we are going with our full force going in. And of course with various land anyway. So, the fun fact about the landing at Leyte, by the way, MacArthur, there's a famous picture of him returning and everything, and I believe the spot where he returned is now a municipality named MacArthur on the island of Leyte. It, by the way, was the 40. It was like the 44th or 41st anniversary of his first arrival at Leyte back when he was a young officer, when he was sent to the Philippines to survey the area, and he had surveyed Leyte in the Gulf. So he actually landed on the anniversary of that.
Oh, wow. That's quite a coincidence.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You would say coincidence, though. I'm going to bet MacArthur planned it, right?
Well, yeah,
we're going to attack at this time, guys.
I guess I bet the first time he landed, his mom was probably already there with binoculars to make sure that he landed as ordered.
Yeah. Some fun facts about Leyte. At this point, this is the biggest land battle we have with the Japanese. We're talking hundreds of thousands of our men committed to it. Japan commits quite a few troops as well. Uh, Losses on Leyte, and the thing about Leyte is that some people thought that Leyte had almost no defenders at all. MacArthur, I think, accurately was like, no, it's defended. Uh, and our losses, considering the battle, were light. And you got to also think of Leyte had some rough terrain. We don't have air supremacy. The Japanese are able to run reinforcements in. So in some ways, Leyte should have been a worse battle for us. But one of the reasons our losses were light was because the army tactically showed a lot of caution. You run to the Japanese, you stop, you shell them. And that was the whole thing. That's one of the reasons it takes longer on Leyte than expected is, remember, we don't have as many aircraft able to help out at first. So they had to rely a lot on artillery in this battle, especially in the first going. Uh, MacArthur started to get upset with the ground commander at Leyte, which was General Kruger. You know much about this guy?
I don't really, except I know that he did run into some difficulties. I remember talking about him on the general stream.
Yeah, Kruger was actually born in Germany. Actually, he immigrated to America when he was 4 years old. Um, he is a true example of a man who went from private to general. He enlisted in the army as a private and fought in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. He was known for being a careful commander. Uh, oh, by the way, I think he's the only Army general in World War II who did not graduate high school. Uh,
Really?
but yeah, but I mean, he joined the army as a young man. He showed promise, and that's the thing is, he really caught the eye of Marshall. Because remember, Marshall had his favorites. Marshall, in particular, liked guys who were good at training, and Kruger was a training expert. He is, like most American generals of World War II, relatively careful, prefers to blast them with artillery. Uh, it was often said that Kruger was still at heart a foot soldier. So I wouldn't say he's beloved by his men, but he was pretty well liked. And Kruger himself would often say, the soldiers are good, it's our junior officers that are bad. And he would criticize them for being overly cautious. MacArthur, for one thing, actually did. MacArthur thought about relieving Kruger at one point at Leyte. But at the end of the day, Kruger didn't take much of the spotlight from MacArthur. He was loyal to MacArthur, and he was definitely Marshall's man. And keeping in mind, Marshall and MacArthur, odd relationship there. Not really. Sorry. They've definitely, if he was to have gotten rid of Kruger, that would have upset a man who was not one of MacArthur's allies. Although I wouldn't say call him a bitter enemy either, at least at this point. So keep him around anyway. Oh, and fun fact about this too, MacArthur. This is the phrase he used for these men because his naval commander is Kincaid, the Sixth Army commander in Leyte is General Kruger, and his air commander is General Kenny. So MacArthur referred to them as his Ku Klux Klan.
Wow. Well, I guess at least back then, people, if they found out about that, wouldn't have taken it as being offensive. So.
Yeah, and also keep in mind too, at that point, the KKK was at one of its weaker moments.
Right. I mean, people just went, "Oh yeah, I see the play on
Yeah,
words. I get it. It's fine."
yeah. They're like, "Oh, play on words, haha." Anyways,
Yeah.
of course, MacArthur had probably mentioned about his, was his father who stormed Missionary Ridge and won the Medal of Honor. But anyway, though, the Japanese do eventually launch a last-ditch counterattack at Leyte to destroy the American airfields there. Get this, they actually do a paratrooper drop. That's pretty daring. The Japanese had used paratroopers in 1942 to seize islands in the Dutch East Indies, so they had some experience with it, but this attack fails, of course. And Leyte falls. But it took longer than expected, and Leyte's use as an air base in particular, I've read it wasn't as useful as an air base as they were hoping for. But regardless, the Japanese suffer horrific losses. The Philippines have been penetrated, and MacArthur will be well on his way to attacking Luzon with Eighth Army headed by Etchelberger. And of course, Mindanao is going to be attacked as well.
So were the Philippines as a
So,
whole an army operation?
well, actually, no, that's right. No. Etchelberger takes. I'm sorry, Etchelberger. He does the cleanup on Leyte. Kruger is going to go into Luzon as well. Anyway, you were saying?
So the Philippines as a whole were pretty much an army operation?
pretty much. Another little fun fact of the Philippines campaign: this is the only Mexican unit to see combat in World War II. Um, is a Mexican fighter squadron was deployed to the Philippines.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So yeah, Mexico's there, and of course Australia. Well, Australia mostly with ships though. I don't think they deployed any Australian infantry. Yeah, yeah, the Australians they're gonna be using them to well, they're still in New Guinea because remember there's still Japanese fighting in New Guinea. I mean they can't do much, but you can still have men there to contain them, make sure they don't cause any problems. And they're gonna be involved in landings in the Dutch East Indies in 1945. So that's what the Australians are going to be up to at that point. Anyway, though, so yeah, no, this is mostly an army operation. Anyways, the Leyte Gulf is the army and navy both saw decisive battle, and in both cases failed and took heavy losses. The are and in both cases, while we did take losses, nothing crippling. Um, so this is pretty much a fiasco. And the Yamashita the entire time is going, why are we throwing men away at Leyte? And we should be concentrating on the defense of Luzon because Yamashita understood Luzon is the real prize. Once Luzon falls, then you can really start cutting those supply lines. You know, so he understood that, but he was overruled by his theater commander.
Ah.
All right. Yeah. So, okay, it's about 9-ish right now. So we did want to do Burma and China and then do the super chats real quick. I'm going to take a quick break. Is that fine with you?
Yeah, I'll also take a quick break, maybe 5 minutes or so.
Yeah, it sounds about right. All right, everybody. Be back in about 5.
All right. And I'll see what we can put up. How about a picture of Mao Zedong? Since we'll be focusing on China, but see you guys in a couple. Alright, so I'm settled back in. I'm definitely excited for some of these super chat questions. Um, can't wait to hear some of Sean's answers on a couple of these. I won't say which ones, but I think you can probably guess. Alright, let's see. So, close these two out. We can enjoy the Type 95 Hago light tank. How about that? We'll wait for Sean to return. What I really want is Mao Zedong in the 1940s. See if we can find one. I guess we only get the older Mao. Well, is this supposed to be him in 1945, I guess? With Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, that's a good one.
Hello,
Oh, hey.
you back?
I am. Yeah.
Looks like. Yeah,
So,
there you are.
alright. Well,
What's going on?
not much. Just pulling up more images we can use.
Okay,
Trying to find young Mal, because apparently most of the images of Mal are from the 60s and 70s, so trying to find
that makes sense.
young Mal.
Mhm. So, for Burma, you said you read up on that one. Do you want to do that one? And I'll
Sure.
just throw in like questions and insights. All right.
Yeah, we can talk about Burma real fast. So, the Japanese will make an alliance with Thailand. So, the Thai army will actually fight on behalf of Japan. So that's a key factor in the theater. Let's see if we can pull up a map of that, because I've found some Mongolian soldiers, but I've not found the Thai army from World War II.
They didn't really deploy that many men. In Thailand, uh, I used to know a little bit more about it, but Thailand was a country that always played off the British and the French, and both sides saw it to their advantage because Thailand's between Malaysia and what was then French Indochina. So
Right, although
Thailand,
although they did
what's up?
apparently beat some Chinese units, so they beat both nationalist and communist Chinese units at various times.
Okay.
So,
So they might have deployed some Thai units to China then. I know Thailand had a small air force supplied with Japanese army aircraft, and they did fight a war with Vichy France in 1940, and there was a naval battle. The French defeated the Thai fleet. Thailand was in many ways bullied into joining Japan, and views. Thailand wasn't like vigorously pro-Japanese. The Americans definitely saw this as them being bullied into it. You
Right.
know, yeah.
And I don't think
But
they
there were also these
deployed.
economic.
I don't think they deployed that many men. But then again, the theater as a whole, the Indo-Chinese theater, there were not that many men deployed. I mean, this is pretty small scale stuff compared to a lot of the land battles we've talked about in the past.
Yeah, especially for World War II. But also keeping in mind, I mean, supplying an army in Burma—that's a nightmare.
It is. I mean, I guess, especially in 1942 campaign, the Japanese really invade with about 2 divisions worth of men. And those aren't even necessarily full strength divisions, but they still are able
It
to
is
overrun.
also, yeah. Well, that's also they got to say the Japanese conquest of Burma is not talked about enough as either a British disaster or a brilliant show of Japanese generalship. Uh, Japan, once again, much like at Singapore, they captured Burma way ahead of schedule, which meant in
Yes.
1942 there was even then some discussion about, well, why don't we just invade India? They stopped because of logistics. But I've heard more than one historian say, yeah, if they invaded India, there was nothing to stop them at that point because the British forces that they defeated in Burma, they ripped them to pieces.
The difference was, though, the British still had forces in India proper, but they just weren't in position to do anything about East India. So a lot of it
Yeah,
was the British had a very European focus, and a lot of the troops they were raising in India were being trained to defend the Northwest, so basically Pakistan, as we think of it today, or they were being trained for North Africa. So the British had raised a lot of Indian troops in 1942, but most of them were still being trained. A lot of them didn't have gear yet. And also, there was a very valid fear that because of Indian nationalism, the Indians would refuse to fight. And there was also an Indian nationalist figure with the Japanese, and he had a small
yeah,
contingent with him. I'm trying to find his name in my notes.
he
Oh,
did. Yeah, he
Bose.
they had bows. They had a small division. There's gonna be Indians fighting Indians at some points in this in this campaign. Yeah, the British had to transfer. That's actually one of the reasons why Rommel uh, survives after Operation Crusader is because the British have to transfer divisions to the Pacific Theater to deal with all of this. And
Yeah,
particularly, the Australian government demands their divisions be sent back.
yeah, the
Um,
Australians refused to participate in Burma.
yeah,
And
yeah.
it's interesting
And,
because actually the Pacific makes a mistake because one of the bar scenes in the Pacific when they're in Australia, one guy's talking about how his brother or somebody or he had just gotten back from Burma, and that's almost certainly not possible.
uh, well, they had some units in Malaysia. I mean, he might have been there as like an observer or something.
Yeah, but yeah, they did not deploy Anzac formations. So they were relying on a lot of secondary units, mostly Indian, but they did end up throwing
You
in the
say
7th
you're
Armored
saying
Brigade.
Anzac. It's interesting. New Zealand. Yeah. Well, an interesting thing about Anzacs to mention: New Zealand did not recall forces to go fight the Japanese, although their air force fought them. New Zealand kept their division in Italy throughout this time. Should also be kept in mind too. India this time, the Indian forces did very well in the First World War. It was felt the British did not fulfill their promises to India when the First World War was over. They did not grant them as much autonomy as they wanted. That led to a lot of turbulence in India. And so World War II, India is much more lukewarm on it. And it should also be noted that uh, a variety of Indian divisions in World War II really do underperform.
Yeah, and there's a
The,
lot of
the,
reasons for that too.
yeah, I'd say India and South Africa, their divisions tend to not be particularly good as far as the empire units go. But anyway, yeah, go right ahead and let's talk about what happens in 1944 in
Well,
India, the Battle of Imphal. Imphal.
Well, so by this point, the 14th Army, the British have built, both sides have built up their forces over the course of 1942 and 43. So you go from having a couple divisions battling each other in 1942 to getting about 4 to 5 divisions in 1943, and by the end of the year, each army is, I think, around 8 to 10 divisions each. So they're actually kind of respectable. The British Army's 14th Army under William Slim, who will become one of the great British commanders of the war. Probably the most forgotten, though, and his army is often called the Forgotten Army. because they do some excellent stuff in 44 and 45, but doesn't get talked about. On the other side, you have the Japanese 15th Army. So it's technically the same army and same commander as in 1942, but of course, it has more than two divisions now. And the commander of that army, I'm trying to find his name. It is.
Otoguchi.
Yeah,
Otoguchi.
Otoguchi.
Yeah, he was involved in the Marco Polo Bridge incident.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so one of the major results in 1942 is that the Burma Road had been cut. That would have been the lifeline to Chiang Kai-shek. So Stilwell, working under the British, had actually created sort of an extension into India. So now there's still supplies going to China. Because remember, China's coasts are occupied by Japan, so they get all their
Well, they're
war
flying
material.
over. They're flying over the hump.
Right,
They're
the
flying over
Himalayas.
the Himalayas.
Yeah, so there's an airlift at one point, but eventually the road reopens. The Stilwell Road, or Ledo Road, it was actually known first before Chiang Kai-shek wanted to honor Stilwell. But anyway, so the Japanese had actually, because their main objective going into Burma in many ways was to cut off China. And then once the British folded so easily, that's when they started thinking about invading India. But it took all of 1943 to build up for that. So you get to 1944, the Japanese have a dual operation. So you got Ichigo, which I guess we'll talk about a little bit later, where they're actually trying to finish
Yeah.
off China. And that's accompanied by Yugo, which is the operation to invade India. And this is only going to be an 8-division army, 15th going into India. The plan is they have got the nationalist Bose with them, and he will get the Indians to rise up. And then there will be a general revolt against the British. And then miraculously, the British will be booted from India. India will become this huge ally of Japan. And accompanied with the fall of China, Japan's fortunes will turn so dramatically on land that they will win the war. So that's kind of the grand strategy here. But it's also a little bit comically optimistic because part of their plan revolves around capturing all the stores for Slim's army. Because unless they capture all Slim's supplies, they don't have enough ammo and food to get into India. So they not only have to win, they have to win quickly and capture all the war material intact. So no big deal. Pretty easy, right? Well, when they attack, the fighting will revolve around two areas. One is in Fall. The other one is... Let's see.
Make sure it's a K. Kohima.
Yeah,
How do you
Kohima.
pronounce it, though?
Yeah, I think it's Kahima. So you've got these two areas. So Slim divides the troops between them. He has to airlift some men to reinforce one of them at one point. And then he just digs in and orders his men to fight to the last. And the Japanese
It's
are
also,
also... Oh, go ahead.
it should also be noted that with Slim, he's saying that he can invade Burma and was trying to make that case. And a lot of people, for one thing, they're not there. For one thing, he's low on the list of logistical support for the British, right? But also, a lot of people say he can't really do it because Burma's terrain is horrible, some of the worst in the world for military operations. But Slim knows it. When the Japanese invade, should be noted, Slim's excited because his dream thing was to have the Japanese attack him first, win a defensive victory, chew him up, and then follow it up. And thereby, by the fact the Japanese can even launch an attack, also proves that you can make an attack like this.
Right. And so this kind of worked out exactly the way he wanted it. The Japanese will try to surround him to try to force him out of his defensive positions. And they do that, but he doesn't budge, and he just keeps resupplying himself by air. And the Japanese then can't go on without his supplies. They have to start attacking him. So they just ram their forces into him over and over and over. And of that 150,000 man army that comes into Burma to take him out, most of them end up getting destroyed.
Yeah.
And this is because the commander just kept hurling his men in. And this is even after the monsoon season started, because before this, the monsoons usually start, I think, in early April. Maybe early to late April, somewhere in April. And usually that traditionally is when you stop, because now it's just going to be heavy rain all the time, and conditions are terrible for trying to fight. But the Japanese kept attacking during the monsoon, and that did not help them at all. And so the Japanese effectively destroyed one of their best armies, quality-wise. And this was probably the worst disaster of the war so far for them, in terms of losses.
The army, yes. There's a few things to note with that one. Slim was confident of victory, but it should be noted the Indian Army at this point didn't have that great reputation in World War II. This is probably arguably their best hour. At the same time, Uh, this battle really destroyed the Japanese army's mystique, both for those in the British side who were fearful of fighting Japan after their victories of 1942, but also for the Japanese themselves. Because, like you said, the soldiers they're launching into this offensive, these are good soldiers. But a big problem with this is Mutaguchi and his subordinates hate each other. In fact, Mutaguchi fired all three of his division commanders during the battle.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
Mutaguchi, by the way, from what I've read about him, one of these hardcore militarists, very aggressive commander. He he's religious, but he also really liked comfort women. So this guy, he's chasing girls and stuff, and he was in the rear during all of this.
yeah. Well, it's also worth noting too. We're talking about how quality the army was. So some of those divisions that were reallocated after 1942, many of those were the units that had done those really impressive late 1941 operations, like overrunning the Dutch East Indies. So those
Yeah,
were those divisions. So like probably half the divisions he had were hyper elite, and then he
that's the other
just
thing too
hurled
about
them into
this
the
one.
machine guns and got them destroyed.
Well, one of the ways the Japanese, what they'd done in Malaysia, and it had worked was that you would the British tend to be on the roads. All right. Oh, well, same thing in Leyte, actually, which is one of the reasons the Japanese were able to launch some of those counterattacks at Leyte was because Americans also stuck to the roads a lot. So stick to the roads. What you do with the Japanese is you pin them in the front while another group infiltrates. And so they're repeating those tactics here. But Slim is an excellent commander. He's learned his lessons. He's going to get Mountbatten to secure air transport, which, by the way, was a hassle because to do that, they had to get permission. And Franklin Roosevelt, I think he called Mountbatten or something, and gave him a long speech about how they can have the air transport for this battle, but damn it, we need to get those supplies to Chiang Kai-shek as fast as possible. So it was a hassle, all right. But thankfully, Mountbatten and Slim, while these two men, you could not think of two men more dissimilar than those two. Mountbatten was like a tall, handsome, playboy type, Churchill favorite. An interesting officer, daring, but also could be a bit frivolous. Slim, very much an infantryman soldier, so a soldier's soldier. Oh God, what was the one he did? He would tell some jokes to the men, and there's one I want to find here for you real quick that's really funny. Okay, but the other thing too is, so they're able to bring these supplies in, and by doing that, they're countering the Japanese tactics. Now, Mutaguchi believed to his dying day that his plan was going to work, right? And it's actually a pretty daring plan. He actually did get the jump on them briefly.
Yeah,
Because
especially at Kohima.
exactly, but Mutaguchi blamed the commander, whose name was Sato. Sato and him, I mean, doesn't have a good relationship with anybody, but these two really, really hate each other. To the point when Sato died in 1959, Mutaguchi had men show up to the funeral with pamphlets talking about how this guy lost the battle and the war at the funeral.
God damn, that's petty.
But I mean, these two hate each other. Sato did not believe in the offensive. I got this line he has right here. And Sato was also like Slim in a lot of ways, a soldier. I'll take this opportunity, gentlemen, of making something quite clear to you. Miracles apart, every one of you is likely to lose his life in this operation. It isn't simply a question of the enemy's bullets. You must be prepared for death by starvation. Yeah, so
Yeah.
and and Mutaguchi, by the way, I want to say, like, I think Mutaguchi was a daring, aggressive commander who actually didn't have that bad of a plan, but he's just a rotten, horrible human being. He's one of the most, yeah, I found to be one of the most widely despised or just personally hated generals of World War II. I rarely ever run into anybody saying much good about him as a person. And also, this guy was integral to starting the war with China as well. So it's kind of a miracle in some ways that he didn't suffer anything for war crimes or anything else. And I'm going to read that book about that, and I hope they bring that up. I'm really curious how this guy avoided, getting shot or at least prison time.
Yeah, that is an interesting question because, but then again, I guess maybe the British kind of liked him because he threw away an army in this fashion.
Yeah, like
So,
But I mean, there are some people who think that if they had not gone for Komin, but had actually bypassed it, because remember the Japanese are good at bypassing, and gone for Dimapur, that they would have actually won the operation. There are people who think that. I'm not. I don't know. I only just read stuff on this in both a biography of Slim and another book on this. I am agnostic on that question. I do give Motoguchi some credit though for having uh, a pretty good plan overall. But the problem is, you got to go over those mountains. The logistics are bad. The Japanese are only bringing just enough food for what I think was 3 weeks. They had to leave behind a lot of their artillery. So the way the plan's working out is you are either going to win right away or you've lost. And where we can really blame Motoguchi is he kept those men over there fighting, even when it's clear the operations failed.
Right.
That's really where he's screwing up, right? And why did he do that? I mean, was it because he was into Bushido?
It could be that, or he was delusional enough because he did have Slim's army surrounded, and he was convinced Slim was about to fall back, which would give him a chance to attack. And he was really baffled that Slim wouldn't budge because he thought if I get to the envelopment, then he has to fall back. But he didn't count on the airlift, I guess.
I found this. I found this description of Motoguchi. He was fond of sex, sake, and publicity.
So he was kind of the general's general, sort of exactly what you would expect out of Imperial Japan. Like if you created a stereotypical, if you created like a stereotypical Japanese officer that you imagine based on the ideology of the empire, it would be that guy.
All right. Oh, here's that Slim story I want to tell you. So he was talking to a battalion, and and Slim was very, very beloved by the men, very popular. I say that because most World War II generals are fairly distant figures, but he is an example of somebody who was amongst the men a lot. And one of these soldiers yelled, "We'll follow you, General." And then Slim called back, "Don't you believe it? You'll be a long way in front of me." And the other thing too is should be noted though that actually Slim is a rare example of a British general who would go to the front lines. Actually, almost died on a few occasions. So in some ways it wasn't true, but yeah, just jokes like that, things like that is what endeared Slim to so many people. Unlike Sen Motoguchi, who never visits men and is generally despised.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, God, what a disaster! And like I said, besides the fact that they've lost a lot of these elite units, of course, Slim is going to follow that up and invade northern Burma. I don't remember reading about any major battles happening again until 1945, but there are lots of rearguard actions as they're attacking to northern Burma.
Yeah, most of the actions were once you get into 1945, and a lot of that was a brilliant series of maneuvers. So he managed to feint the Japanese out of position and then take places like Mandalay without really having to fight that hard for it. And he also got them to abandon most of their best defensive terrain by just maneuvering around it.
Yeah, Operation Dracula, where I think maybe like 25 guys got lost in that amphibious landing. And then there's Ramtree Island, which we won't discuss that one because I've been reading up on that one. But that'll come for the next one we get into 1945.
Yeah, and also a very brilliant operation to retake Rangoon. Slim's 1945
that's Dracula.
campaign is okay. Yeah, Slim's 1945 campaign is probably one of the most underrated and underdiscussed Allied operations.
Yeah.
But it's also worth noting, though, that even though they boot the Japanese out of Burma, the Japanese still have a very strong presence overall in Indochina, even when the war ends.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And the other thing, too, is that while this is towards the end, in the midst of this operation, and we kind of held it off on this one to have a little more time to discuss it, but also the operation wasn't completed until after Battle of Philippine Sea. And the same thing with another one that's going on, which is where the Chinese Chinese and Merle's Marauders. Actually know somebody who has a relative who was in Merle's Marauders. By the way, the last of Merle's Marauders died like a year ago or something in Pittsburgh. They are going after Mishinah. I'm pronouncing it like I heard it in the movie Merle's Marauders, a 60s movie my grandpa. I watched it with my grandpa once back in the day. But anyways, so at the same time, the Chinese army is also attacking. And this involves Vinegar Joe Stilwell. Want me to get into this guy?
Oh, of course.
Oh yeah. Do you know much about him?
I know a little bit because I remember we covered him back when we looked at the Generals of World War II.
Yeah. To say he's controversial is to put it lightly. They didn't call him Vinegar Joe for nothing, though, right?
Yeah, he was
Uh,
slightly acerbic,
yeah.
and he looks like it too.
What's up?
He also looks like he would have that kind of personality.
So Stillwell is one of these men who just, I mean, he has great strengths and stupendous weaknesses. Uh, he was considered a first-rate tactician and a good trainer. In fact, he was supposed to be the one in charge of like the Operation Torch type landings, uh, but that didn't happen. And Roosevelt sends him to China because he did have experience in China, and now he's going to be with Chiang Kai-shek. And Stillwell is somebody who does not understand the political realities of China. Now, the China theater had been quiet since 1941. Before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had launched a major offensive to try to win the war in China. Uh, that led to that was the Chinese army holds them off in 1941, and the reason, of course, they're doing that is they want to see if they can knock China out before attacking, America and the Netherlands and everything. So that attack fails. The China theater is mostly quiet. That said, Stilwell had sent Chiang Kai-shek's best divisions, what's left of his army, because keeping in mind the Chinese army, its quality from 1937 until then varies wildly. You have units that are as good as anybody else's and just absolute garbage.
Yes. Also, it's worth
So,
mentioning the
yeah,
Chinese mentality and the organization. So the Nationalist Army, each so-called army was actually a division, and it
yeah,
was probably Stilwell. It might have been someone else, but one of the Western observers asked, "So why did you guys pull your artillery out as soon as the battle started to go south? Why didn't you try to use your artillery to get momentum back?" And they said, "Listen, if the 25th Army loses its guns, it's no longer the best army."
yeah.
So, yeah, it's a very different mindset, and most of the guys commanding these armies are kind of local grandees who very much see themselves as independent, and they often do not cooperate. So that's partly
Yeah. Well,
why, in many ways, the communist forces were actually easier to work with than the nationalist forces, is because they kind of had
although
a slightly more modern outlook on warfare.
yeah, although you cannot trust the communists at all during this, but we'll get to that. uh, but the the case of Chiang Kai, so with Chiang Kai-shek, um, one of the things he's able to do is take that aid from the Allies, distribute it to the people who were allied to him within China. And someone like Stilwell was like, well, why don't we just concentrate all the best equipment and all of our equipment into a few of our best divisions? And Chiang Kai-shek's like, if you do that, I don't have a power base, and continue to I can't continue to fight the war that I'm fighting because Chiang Kai-shek is also a controversial figure. He's in a difficult spot. In some ways, it's a miracle Chiang Kai-shek can keep together a nationalist army in the first place. Uh, that being said, Chiang Kai-shek correctly predicts to Stilwell and says, if you take my best divisions to Burma in 1942 and get them chopped up, the next time the Japanese hit us, I won't have a reserve to stop them. And this is going to prove true. Now, at the same time, Claire Chennault, who was the commander of the Flying Tigers, he's the air commander in China, also a controversial figure as well. Like Stilwell, he attracted enemies, but he won over Madame Chang. By the way, I was in World War II class when we heard that she died.
Really?
Yeah, he came in, said, a professor came in. He was like, "Well, probably the last, major leading figure of World War II died today." Uh, as opposed to like say like a U-boat ace or something, right?
Right.
Anyway, that was so Chiang Kai. So he Chenault won over the two people he had to win over no matter what, though, and they stayed loyal to him. Chenault and Stilwell hate each other. They're constantly arguing about strategy and what you can and can't do. Uh, Chenault was a good air commander. His pilots figured out early on the kind of tactics used against the Japanese, since the Japanese at that point their aircraft still emphasized maneuver, so you don't get into a dogfight. You hit and run. Um,
And dive.
so anyway, though, yeah, exactly. So they figured it. They at least have figured it out, although it took some time for that to trickle over. What's going to happen is that Chenault was one of those like aircraft obsessives, the kind of guy who thought that with 200 bombers you could conquer a country. And he believed that when the Japanese attacked, he would simply use his aircraft to blast them. And and I'm a big, this is a big thing I always say is that if you wonder who wins in World War II, it's almost always who controls the air. However, that's also when you still have an army that can hold the line. Stilwell is correct in saying that this Chinese army is so bad that if they attack, you're not going to have time to launch enough airstrikes for it to matter. Those airstrikes to matter, the men have to hold the line. They simply cannot. But at the same time, you can blame Stilwell for expending their reserves in Burma in 1942. And it takes a long time to build up another cadre. And here's where it gets bad. He takes that cadre and attacks into Burma, try to take Missional, which he does eventually. So, and keeping in mind, almost everybody agreed that Stilwell was a very good tactician, although some people would call him an up-jumped company commander.
Damn.
Yeah. Uh, oh yeah. So Chiang Kai-shek and Stilwell, I mean, they are constantly fighting with each other. They both have their points for their right and wrong. Uh, I think Chiang, though, I'd probably favor him a bit more. Certainly, he was corrupt. Not him himself. I mean, people under him were corrupt, but that's the way that system worked, and that's how you keep the Chinese in the war. I think a big problem is we just weren't able to get the Chinese enough more supplies, both for the Burma Road being cut, but then also because in 1943 we were supposed to launch an amphibious operation in Asia to help get Burma back, and Roosevelt canceled it. That was Operation Buccaneer, unnamed. Anyway, so at any rate, though, when the Japanese then launch Ichigo, which is this massive offensive, and it's a lot of people like to say this is 1944 when the Axis launch an offensive, they lose, right?
Yeah.
But not here, guys. Oh no, oh no. This is a hot knife through butter situation. Now, what's the point of Ichigo? The point is, knock out. Maybe you can knock out the Chinese army. Another one is that they realize that the submarine war is getting better, so there's this idea of why don't we try to have an overland supply route to get the stuff out of Southeast Asia, bring it up to say Shanghai, and then it's a relatively short convoy ride to Japan, as opposed to the long route we're using right now. Also, knock out the air bases because it's from the air bases in China that they're starting to bomb Japan. Although they're not doing it with too much success. And the operation is a stunning success. They will inflict heavy losses. The airfields are overrun. Stillwell is correct about that. But Stillwell, instead of shifting over to try to help out in China, just goes, you're in your own... it's your bed, you sleep in it. That became his mentality. That's how bad the relations are between him with Chenault and Chiang.
Damn.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't realize that. I thought that Chiang actually respected Stillwell because he wanted to rename the Leto Road after Stillwell.
He's trying to win him over. And I think what you can see with Chiang is that what I think is happening with Chiang, from what I can read, is that Chiang respected Stillwell as a commander. Right? They thought that he was talented, but at the same time, he's kind of like, you don't realize the difficulties that I'm under. And and then gradually Chang's like, can we get rid of this guy? And eventually he is removed, replaced with Wiedemeyer. By the way, fun thing, Stillwell wrote in his diary. His diary's fun, by the way. It's so blunt, They published it after World War II. But anyway, Stillwell writes in his diary, to be replaced by Wiedemeyer, now that would be an insult.
Man.
Yeah. Wiedemeyer was involved in operational planning most of the time, so he's very much a staff officer. He was also part of a scandal where this thing called the Victory Plan got leaked. This is before we're in the war, and this led to some outrage that Franklin Roosevelt was planning a war, which he was. Although Wiedemeyer at that point was only a major, so there's a lot of debate on how important the Victory Plan was to begin with, but the leak certainly caused an uproar at the time. Wiedemeyer came in 1945. He did a little bit better than Stillwell. He definitely got along with him. But you can see a lot of Stilwell's complaints. Wiedmeyer's making those as well. He's just taking it better, you know. Also, by that time, the situation is stabilized a bit. But what this operation does is it ruins the nationalist army. And there are many people who believe that this is what's going to ensure, this is one of the things that's going to ensure Chiang is going to lose the Chinese Civil War when World War II is over.
Yeah. Apparently, there's also a
Should be
book
noted,
out.
though.
There's a book out now about
Yeah.
Wiedemeyer called General Albert C. Wiedemeyer, America's Unsung Strategist in World War II.
Okay, that might be interesting. Once again, he was a strategic thinker and planner. He spent most of his time, in that office. Anyway, here's a fun one for you about this too. The Japanese, while they were victorious, they expended a lot of ammunition and supplies. So while they didn't take as heavy a manpower loss as the Chinese. They shot their bolt, and China was not knocked out of the war. You mentioned the communists. Now, the communists, of course, are led by Mao Zedong. Uh, sorry, so, but even though they're led by Mao Zedong, there's a lot of factions, so it'd be improper to call Mao a true, how should we say, he's not a true dictator at this point. There's a few other people who would do their own thing, and I say it's because Mao would openly cheer when the Japanese would conquer more territory, because in his mind they're fighting Chiang. So what you do is his Mao's strategy is brilliant in this regard, because Mao, awful human being, but he is, I believe, one of the great military strategists of the 20th century. And his idea is, the Japanese take territory. Well, once they do that, you send your own agents in there, because Chiang was not that big on guerrilla warfare, right? They are. Now, the Chinese Communist partisan attacks against the Japanese, I mean, they are doing attacks, but they're not super effective. I think they do get more effective in 1945, but they're being told to fight a low-level guerrilla war. What it's more about is building cadres, and you do enough guerrilla fighting to win people over. And those people in those provinces would say, hey, Chiang got evicted here, the commies came in, at least they're fighting them. Even if Mao Zedong is making sure they don't fight them too much, right?
Right.
Yeah. um,
Well, Mao was also
So-
really good at self-promotion, because he had convinced a pretty large percentage of the Chinese population by the time the war was over that he had been far more effective than Chiang Kai-shek. And so when they start fighting
Yeah.
each other again, that's a decisive factor in how people pledge their allegiance.
Yes, he was very good at propaganda. Now, the communists did launch one massive offensive at one time, which was in August 1940. I love the name. It's called the 100 Regiments Offensive. Mao did not want this to happen. One of his rivals carried it out, who, by the way, I think was murdered in the 1970s, during the Cultural Revolution. So anyway, I'll say one of his rivals. I mean, him and Mao had a testy relationship, but this guy carries out the offensive. The Japanese are legitimately pissed, right? And they launched a major offensive against the communists, which the orders were boiled down to this: kill all, loot all, burn all. Now, keeping in mind at this time as well, Stalin was giving more support to Chiang Kai-shek than Mao Zedong. Because, Stalin's a realist. He actually thought Chiang was going to be more the future of China, and the Americans were also kind of saying, hey, we'd prefer you to back Chiang over Mao. But of course, some of those Americans went to go to Mao, and Mao won them over, a lot of those guys who visited him. And like you said, overstated what he was doing. So Mao does start to win some supporters amongst the Americans, but in the end, the support's really going to Chiang. But don't worry, when the war's over, Stalin, like a good communist, puts all the support he can into Mao.
And I guess it's also worth mentioning, Mao was very charismatic, whereas I don't get the impression that Chiang Kai-shek was very personally impressive at all.
No. Chiang Kai-shek wasn't, but Chiang Kai-shek he did understand, he's one of the people who understood how to create networks of patronage and support. He was one of those kind of leaders.
So it's kind of like a political coalition builder, kind of like a Mitch McConnell type guy in a way.
Yeah, yeah. Mitch, one other thing about Mao Zedong I think is interesting is like he loves Stalin. I mean, now Stalin thought personally that Mao was like an idiot in his mind, right? So Stalin wasn't impressed with Mao in particular, but Mao really liked Stalin. So in the 1950s, when Khrushchev gave the secret speech where he denounced Stalin, Mao was appalled, and that has actually led to an entire thinking in China about the dangers of revisionism. Because there's a belief in China, there's one belief in China that the reason the Soviet Union falls is that they denounced Stalin, when in their mind they should have propped him up as a hero. You know, a great man who had built, in their mind, a man who had made the USSR into an industrial powerhouse and took on and defeated the Nazis. You know, but neither here nor there. I just want to mention that one because Mao loves Stalin. All right.
That's
um,
interesting. I guess too,
yeah.
it would make sense that the Soviets wouldn't think very highly of Mao because Mao tried to adjust Soviet doctrine so heavily because he realized that his country is mostly peasants. And so
Yeah.
the adjustments he made to sort of Chineseify doctrine were things that a lot of the Soviets really objected to because they just thought he didn't understand the doctrine. They didn't see the need to adapt it.
Yeah. I do want to read these two Mao quotes that the encyclopedia has here. These are great. All right. Um, when great heroes give full play to their impulses, they are magnificently powerful, stormy, and invincible. Their power is like a hurricane arising from a deep gorge, and like a sex maniac on heat and prowling for a lover. There's no way to stop them. This is how he viewed himself, by the way. Um, and oh, you like Barry? He's one of history's notorious rapists. What's the other one too? Oh, he was talking about um, people's attitude about death, and he said human beings are endowed with a sense of curiosity. Why should we treat death differently? Don't we want to experience strange things? Death is the strangest thing, which you will never experience if you go on living. Some are afraid of it because the change comes too drastically. But I think this is the most wonderful thing. Where else in the world can we find such a fantastic and drastic change? Then the encyclopedia guy says, on the evidence, Mao relished satisfying people's curiosity.
Yeah, I guess that's
Yeah.
true. Um, Also, I guess I remember reading about his propaganda later on, especially when he was getting older, and he started some sort of myth that he swam in, I think, the Yellow River. He swam supposedly some ridiculous length of mileage as an old man, and then he put that story out there, and a lot of people actually believed it.
Oh yeah, they had photos of him in the Yellow River and saying, "Look, he did it." It's like, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, he
anybody can
got
take
in
a
the
photo of a
water.
river,
That's pretty
dude.
nice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of funny you mention that too. Mao was known for his bad hygiene as well.
Really?
Um, oh yeah, and I think I remember reading somewhere he liked scratching his crotch in front of people.
Man.
Yeah, yeah, he's a disgusting human being, but but I will say a very first-rate strategist. So the Ichigo offensive, its main thing is to break Chiang Kai-shek, and that's going to play a major role in Mao eventually winning. The communists fought a low-level guerrilla war against the Japanese, which was more about them winning the civil war that would come afterwards, eyes on the prize, if you will. Mao did win over some admirers in America who would visit him. He was very good at that. He eventually did win over Joseph Stalin, although I never respected the guy. That's for damn sure. Uh, and the Japanese Ichigo offensive is a success, but the Japanese shot their bolt, and in the end, they are winning a major victory against the country that they can't really knock out of the war. You know, they you would you would have to have more men and do more damage, even though the damage is considerable. And make no mistake about it, Ichigo should not be seen as some Pyrrhic victory for the Japanese. I mean, they really did get stick it to the Chinese and accomplished the other goals of knocking the airfields out and creating those land connections. Although by that time it was too late to really get a system set up to get the supplies to Japan. You know, in other words, the other defeats are so catastrophic that winning there is not decisive enough.
I see.
You know, but yeah, once again, make no mistake about it, it's a major Japanese victory.
From what I
Um,
understand, too, this is also a time when Mao was able to blame Ichigo on Chiang Kai-shek, and most people believe that it was Chiang Kai-shek's fault. So this is, again, is something that after the war helped Mao out immensely.
Yes, yes, and in some ways they're correct. I mean, Stilwell was saying with the air. Stilwell blamed it all on the airfields. He said if it wasn't for your Stilwell essentially is like if it wasn't for your stupid airfields bombing the Japanese homeland, they wouldn't be doing this. And Stilwell was correct when he said they'll just overrun these terrible Chinese units and capture your airfield, and there goes your ability of aircraft to blow up the Japanese army when it attacks. Right. So this is actually a rare case where the side with well, actually, wait, who had air supremacy in this one, or not really? Or
Well,
I
I think
think
the
this one
Japanese
is
still had air supremacy in China because the Flying Tigers and whatever they were replaced by, whatever group that was once the U.S. entered the war. I mean, it was still a relatively small outfit. I don't think they would have been able to establish air superiority.
no, they're pretty big. Yeah, no, they don't have air superiority. I think this is more like 1943 Eastern Front, where neither side actually has air superiority. You know, um, that both sides have parity. I believe it favored the Japanese. When I've that's what I've read. The Japanese had the numbers, but the Americans had the better aircraft and the better pilots. And that's something to keep in mind too. Uh, Navy pilots were just better trained than Army pilots. Doesn't mean that there weren't great Army pilots or units, but
Actually, all the leading
these
aces were Army Air Corps.
no, there's a number of them were Navy as well.
The really high ranking ones though, like Dick Bong.
I'm not talking about U.S. I'm talking about Japan.
Oh, okay, yeah, you're right about that. Then I mean, yeah, you're right. The Japanese army definitely had worse planes and also less trained pilots.
Yeah, the phrase was the Navy has eagles and the Army has chickens. Uh, that's a bit unfair. There are definitely some really good Army individual units, especially in 19, some of them will be in 1945 with some of the some of the fighters that are going up against the B-29s. So they do have some elite units for sure, but there's it's the Army. The Army didn't even go into 1942 with the greatest reputation as an air force to begin with. But they have numbers over them. But at the same time, the Americans got good aircraft, good air commanders, good pilots. I think it's more of a case of maybe like parity. Probably, So at any rate, though, Operation is a disaster for the Allies, and that takes us into 1945, which we will talk about maybe in 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, should be able to do it pretty much any time after this coming Friday, so long as I know. So I should be
Okay.
able to stream starting on next Saturday until whatever date, because then I'll have to have a couple days to relocate back here. But yeah,
Yeah.
so anyway, I'll let you know, keep you posted on that. But I guess the only other thing to
Excellent.
talk about is the Mongolian frontier, because that will become a huge thing come 1945 again.
Well, has anything happened in 1944? I also can't hang out forever.
No, I mean it's not. There's not going to be that much happening in 1944, but still, there's a lot of tension because of
Oh, yeah.
what had happened in 1939 when there was a big border skirmish, the Kalkan Gall operation, which I didn't know the border dispute was so minor. It was over literally 10 miles of territory.
It's also part of the Army's idea of like, hey, we got to show it to the Russians.
Yes, and it was also very dysfunctional because apparently this time the Kwantung Army had become independent, and they just kind
Yeah.
of did whatever the fuck they wanted without reference back to Tokyo.
Yes.
So they launched like this unsupported attack on the Soviets. So Stalin sent Zhukov out, and then Zhukov launched a huge double envelopment, and he won, and it made his reputation and all that. But it's worth noting, just because of the Japanese quality at the time, there actually was like a 1-to-1 kill death ratio, even though the Soviet army was way better equipped overall.
Oh yeah, no, they also Zhukov. This is when he starts to get that reputation, which he'll have about being careless with his men's lives. Zhukov is not conservative with the lives of his soldiers, that's for sure.
Well,
Anyway,
what else?
well, but yeah, that's gonna be.
Yeah, but the other thing I found interesting that's worth talking about as we push toward 1945 is that the Soviets actually have a very effective spy in Tokyo. And he's actually a
Yeah.
German journalist named George Sorge. And
Hmm.
so he actually is able to give them enough detailed information that in 1941, when they're being pressed at Moscow and they need reinforcements, they know where Japan is about to attack. So they know Japan has no intentions of invading Siberia. So they're able to pull almost all their troops out of Siberia to reinforce Moscow for that 1941 offensive.
Well, his name was Richard, by the way,
Richard,
not
sorry,
George.
Richard
Yeah.
Sorge. But yeah,
Yeah, he.
so the Soviets have a lot of advantages in the East when it comes to intelligence, and so don't be surprised when they have a when the operation in 1945 doesn't go very well for Japan. Is all I'll say.
Mhm.
Not to mention
Yeah,
that
he
Soviet
after
tanks have
doing.
gotten way heavier since in the last 6 years.
Oh yeah, there was actually a good there was a I forgot the name. It was like the Battlefield series of documentaries from the 1990s. They got them on YouTube. And I mean, they did some. I mean, like really good stuff on that one. You know, they would give like these are the commanders, this is the equipment, you know, and they did one on the Manchurian offensive that's definitely worth taking a look at. It's pretty impressive. I mean, the 1945 offensive is very impressive. But anyways, we're going to go ahead and do the super chats, and we can go
Sure.
ahead and move along. All right, man. What we got here?
So our first super chat of the evening came from SC for $5. Thank you, SC. And this person asked, "How do you get the concentrated piss smell from the French Quarter out of your clothes?"
I mean, you clean them?
Uh, but is there a concentrated piss smell? I mean, when I was there, I was stuffed up, so I can't really smell anything. But
It depends on where you go. I mean, if you're hanging on Bourbon Street, but should be know about Bourbon Street, it still smells bad there. It smells way better than it used to,
oh, really?
right? Well, they changed the pipes out finally. And I say that because Bourbon Street was residential, most residential and offices into the 19 early 20th century. 1930s, it starts to get the jazz clubs showing up, and that's really 1940s when it takes off. Uh, but they didn't change the pipes out in most cases. So it was nasty, nasty. That work took a long time. But they changed the pipes out a few years ago. Bourbon Street will always smell bad, but it does not smell nearly as bad as it used to. Um, and then there's like, I mean, no Frenchman Street now is overrun with people, so that's not the French Quarter proper. That's right outside. That one smells bad. What's the other one? Oh, it's Lower Decatur area. They got these pools of dirty water that show up sometimes, like on the side of the street, because that area's pipes can't quite take it, but there's not too many people down there, and that's referred to as Decaturade.
Oh man.
So just don't step in that kind of stuff, right? But I remembered one time, years and years back, I stepped in something in Bourbon Street, and my shoes did change colors.
Holy shit.
I mean, not drastically. It wasn't like they went from like black to pink, but my shoes had a discolored look afterwards, so it was pretty damn gross back then.
Man.
What we got next?
All right, so next we have Blue Ram Tetris Bora for $10 Canadian. Thank you. And they ask, Thersites, I figured you're a big Yakuza fan. Have you played through Like a Dragon and Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth? I could navigate those parts of Japan in real life because I played it. Well, I actually have played Like a Dragon. That's probably one of my favorite games of all time. I have Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth installed, but that's also something I've been putting off until I have like a solid 3 to 4 weeks to play it uninterrupted. So I don't know if I'll be able to get to it until I get moved, permanently relocated. I don't know. But it's definitely something I'm excited about. It's a huge release. And other than that, I've played pretty much all the Yakuza games up to this point. At least all the ones I can access through Xbox. But I have heard what you're saying about how the street layouts between the games and real life cities in Japan are so close that you know exactly where you are if you've played the games. Even if a lot of the businesses that they actually feature in the games are fictional. But still, the actual layouts are identical. So, actually, if I'd ever do go to Japan, I feel like once I go to the red light districts of different cities, I'd pretty much be able to navigate. Which is pretty crazy because I usually suck ass at navigation. But actually, I'm pretty sure I could navigate the red light districts of every Japanese city that's been featured in the Yakuza game. So, but yeah, so thank you. I'm glad to hear that somebody else had that experience. Our next one is from Walk Talk 21 for 1999. They say, longtime watcher of the channel. I was curious to know what you all imagine Operation Downfall looking like if it came to be. Also, thoughts on Eisenhower's Supreme Allied Commander. Was he the best for the job? So,
I had a board game on Downfall that wasn't very good though. That's the Invasion of Japan. I'd want to read more on it. I've heard some arguments that, especially the attack on Honshu, the way it was planned, the terrain actually would have favored us. But I don't know. I think it probably actually would have been hell on earth.
yeah.
But I've also there's one book I'm going to read that actually argues that the atomic bombs weren't even necessary. Japan was so close to internal collapse because of the supplies being cut off that the war would have ended before 1946 anyway. I'll take a look at it and get back to you then. So I'll talk about that next time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Operation Downfall, because I think, what was it, the Soviets were supposed to take Hokkaido, which would have probably been the easiest anyway, just because it has lower population density. Although the terrain there's rough as hell. And then the U.S. would
They got killer. They have killer bears there too, man.
Yeah, no, that's actually the part of Japan that still has nature.
Yeah. No, I said killer bears. Like one of the most horrific animal attacks in history happened in Hokkaido in like 1911 or something.
Yeah, speaking of Hokkaido and the Yakuza games, there's actually a mini game, and I believe it's Yakuza 5, where you break out of prison and you can go hunt bears in Hokkaido.
Damn.
So, anyway, but
That's
yeah,
pretty badass.
it's it would have been very bloody and nasty. That being said, I wonder if there would have been a point where the Japanese spirit would have been broken so severely, especially like if the capital fell and the emperor was captured, where then that sort of fierce resistance, like you saw on Saipan and Palau and other places, where it just would have collapsed. I don't know.
Yeah, Hokkaido. I did read recently that Hokkaido had almost no defenses. Because there was the Japanese were really holding out hope. A lot of the Japanese were holding out hope that the Soviets would intervene to stop the war and become like a negotiating party between both of them. So Hokkaido had almost no defenses. I will say one thing on that. I have really come around to the belief that the Soviet invasion was more important than the atomic bombs. Both for that and because there's starting to be fear in Japan that, oh my God, if we let the Soviets invade Hokkaido, we're going to have communists running around here.
Right, that and Hokkaido also is not all Yamato people. So most of the Japanese islands have one dominant ethnicity, Yamato, but Hokkaido has the Ainu people in pretty large quantities. So just because of ethnic reasons, they might have actually welcomed the Soviets more. So the Soviets might have actually had a decent chance of having a more peaceful occupation, believe it or not. I guess I don't think you've ever played it, but have you ever heard of the game Ring of Red for PS2?
No.
So this was a game where this invasion happened, and then the Japanese islands were divided between the U.S. and Soviets, so it became a huge theater in the Cold War. But also it changed history because Japanese thinkers became so integral to war planning. And so rather than having the Cold War armies we think of today, we ended up with Cold War armies based around giant mechs. Except that because they're Cold War era, cool, they kind of look a little bit janky. So that they're a little bit less advanced, but they're basically the same designs you'd see in like Mech Warrior. And so I think the game is set in probably the 60s or 70s, and you play as a force of like pro-American mechs fighting some pro-Soviet mechs. So anyway, it's kind of neat. And also in that scenario, a lot of Germans who had renounced Nazism after the war had gone to South Japan as military advisors. So that's where a lot of the Nazis ended up, was in South Japan to help combat communism.
Oh man, you ever saw the movie Robot Jocks?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, it's like some of these movies with the Cold War still going on, like around the year 2030 or something. It's directed by Stuart Gordon, who did like Reanimator. Anyways, Robot Jocks is kind of it's not a great movie, but it's interesting premise. Like, you know, there's like after we've like nuked each other, the way that the way we settle disagreements is by having like the best people like pilot mecha robots and then fight over who gets land. So the movie is about like these two guys have to fight each other. He's got to fight like the best Russian they have, and whoever wins will get to keep, either if we win we get to keep Florida. If we lose they get, I'm saying Alaska. That's it. If they win they get Alaska.
Man.
Uh, and you can tell it's like in that regard, it kind of sounds like Rocky Four, but with giant robots. Yeah, robot jocks, man.
All right. Well, our next super chat comes from Panama Chong for $10, and thank you, Panama. They ask, I think you mentioned it last time, but what do you think would have happened if after Chalk and Gull, the Japanese made Russia their main focus in the war? How different does everything go, you think? Huh.
And what are the oil reserves out there? I know there's supposed to be oil. There's not just oil in the Caucasus and Armenia, and Caucasus and Baku, but
I don't think it was
I think I've
discovered yet,
seen
though. I think the
so
Siberian
so
discoveries were
Siberian
later.
stuff. Okay, um, but one advantage the Japanese would have is a shorter logistical tail.
Yeah, because they
You
were
know,
pretty well entrenched in Manchuria by that time.
yeah, but at the same time, you're not exactly conquering. You're not exactly conquering the most important part of the Soviet Union, right?
Well, that and I guess for them to do that, they would have had to kind of give up on that plan they had in 1941 that involved Pearl Harbor and then the invasion of the South Pacific. So they've had to refocus all their efforts on fighting the Soviets, which might have created enough of a distraction that the Soviets would have had to stay out of the Polish invasion and other things. So yeah, in 1939, there's no way the Soviets get involved in the division of Poland because they're too
Well,
occupied. So they have to reallocate a lot of forces out east. And just because of industry, I actually think the Soviets would win, but it would be a very sloppy victory. And it might have actually been more helpful for the Japanese than the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement because it would have tied the Soviets up sufficiently that the Germans could have gone all in on all their operations in Europe without having to worry about the Russians. So they might have actually been able to try Sea Line, assuming the war between Japan and Russia was still happening in 1941.
I don't think they can ever try Sea Line.
Well, logistically and in terms of actually having enough ships, you're probably right. But in terms of maybe attempting it just because they got overconfident, well, maybe.
Yeah, I don't think it happens. Um, Really, nobody took Sea Lion that seriously. I mean, they're planning it, they're saying stuff up because you want to keep it. I think Operation Sea Lion is actually more about having a threatening pose towards the British in your efforts to make them, um, sue for peace.
Yeah,
That's what it's
that
more about than
one
anything else.
another factor though, besides the actual land invasion, is they could actually throw the entire Luftwaffe in because if the Soviets are so tied up out east, then they don't have to keep as many forces on the border, especially because they're not building up for that invasion. Or if they do launch that
Oh,
invasion,
you can, they can no, they you can yeah, you can what I would say is more is not really sea line. It's more like you can keep up your air raids, which the Germans do throughout 1941. The air raids don't stop until like until they're really shifting Luftwaffe aircraft to the east. And keeping in mind too, they still keep large Luftwaffe contingents in the west naturally, right? So
right?
you keep bombing Britain. You can put more into say U-boats and maybe strangle them. But I think more importantly, you can redeploy your units not to invade Britain, but redeploy them to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that would be true. So North Africa might have been Rommel's conquest of Egypt. Another possibility, though, if you're still obsessed with going after Russia, if you strike unexpectedly, that might be more advantageous, but I'm also wondering how long it actually takes to resolve things out in Siberia. Because think about how much the Russians learned from Kalk and Gol. Because going into that battle, their infantry tactics were based on Vorshilov's idea of being non-bourgeois. So don't take cover and that cowardly stuff. Just fight out in the open the whole time. And then eventually Zhukov and others said, this is complete horseshit. You can't do that. So just think about how much they learned fighting the Japanese in that 2-month period or whatever it was. So if they had fought a longer time, then the amount that they would have learned from that, they could have then reapplied to fighting the Germans, and they would have been on a much better war footing. They also would have had a lot of battle-tested units going out back west. So depending on how long it took, that could have massively impacted Barbarossa either in a pro-German or pro-Soviet way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, also be worth noting that if it's the Soviets fighting the Japanese might get their clocks clean, might lose too.
I think the Japanese would have lost long term, but I think it would have taken a while for the Soviets to get their act together. Because, I mean, you even look at Kalk and Gol. I mean, part of the reason why Zhukov was able to do what he did is because he knew the Soviets wouldn't throw in all their troops to defend that position he was attacking. Because he knew that they were under strict orders, that Tokyo was asserting itself. Okay, stop provoking the bear. Stop poking the bear, because we're going south. We're not dealing with this bullshit up here. This is our frontier that we're holding here, and we're moving on elsewhere.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger what ifs is what about Japan in 1941 with the Soviets?
Right, like if they had refrained from attacking the U.S. and Britain, and then instead gone all into Manchuria, that might have actually resulted in the fall of the USSR.
Maybe. The question I had to look at is how far can they go? Because remember, in China, they couldn't go too far inland.
True.
Right?
Although, I mean, we look back at the map of Ichigo, and they were relatively far inland. I mean...
Oh yeah, but remember they're really shooting their bolt there, and they I wonder how far that they can go into the Soviet Union and what kind of resources they can get. Because remember, what's going to precipitate the war is us cutting off their gas.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot going on with that one. I do think that Japan finds itself in a deep strategic bind at this point. But I think so much of that, if people if you really ask me, like, so when did Japan lose this? I'm like, when they invaded China, with no clear way to win the war.
Right. I think they could have probably taken away Manchuria, set that up as Manchukuo, and then withdrawn. They could have probably pulled that off. But yeah, I think occupying the east coast of China tied down. I would say it's probably 80% of their army between Manchuria and East China, if not more.
I think it was 80, might be 70.
Yeah,
70 to 80.
That really limited what else they could do. So I mean, we talked about how small their forces were in, Indochina. We talked about how small some of those invasion forces were in the Pacific. So I mean, like, there was one division pretty much, or just a couple divisions that took out the British on Singapore.
Yeah, they started, and they did start doing redeployments. For instance, they start sending some of those Chinese divisions to the Philippines, and I want to say they dispatched them to Okinawa as well. But I haven't read up on Okinawa in a while. But anyway, let's keep it going, okay?
All right. So next we have one from Royston S. Bailey for £5. Thank you, Royston. They ask, why were the Japanese so uncoordinated with the other Axis powers? They did not see the value in a more coordinated effort.
I mean, they don't really have, they're cut off. They can't have consistent good communications. I mean, you can do some things by wireless, I guess.
Right.
There was, I mean, there was never really a conception in that regard. And keep it in mind too. I mean, look at the case of the Soviets during the war. They don't come in to fight Japan until it's really to their advantage. And we did send some Lend-Lease aid through through Alaska to Russia, and Lend-Lease pilots apparently who like the way Lend-Lease worked. I'm trying to remember. It was like something like Lend-Lease pilots who might like crash in Russia. The Russians would inter them because it was part of the non-aggression pact with the Japanese or something. So the Russians really didn't do anything to help us against Japan until the very end when it's advantageous. But that should be kept in mind too. Ultimately, Stalin is using Churchill and Roosevelt. He does not particularly respect either one of them. Apparently, he viewed Roosevelt as a naive dilettante,
I
and
think that was
Churchill
a.
as a bonehead.
I think the idea of Roosevelt as a dilettante or a lightweight was a problem he had his entire life.
Yeah, but I'm not saying necessarily that Stalin was correct about him on the whole. I do think that Roosevelt, until like probably the last month of his life, was rather naive about the Soviet Union. But keeping in mind that he's and also at the same time, I mean, America has stated goals in World War II of dismembering the British Empire. So I know the Allies are good at coordination too, but they are backstabbing each other. and
Right. Well, the thing is, too, I don't get the impression that. Because if you think about the ideology that guides Imperial Japan and guides Nazi Germany, both of these powers are supremacist. And so
yeah,
both of them regard the other as lesser and just a convenient ally, not as a true friend. So what they want is
yeah.
for their ally to give them information without having to give anything back.
Oh,
So
hey,
let me
I
know
just
your
yeah.
plans so I know when you're going to be distracting the Americans. That way I can do my thing more safely. But I'm not going to tell you shit about what I'm doing,
Yeah,
except in the
yeah.
broadest, possibly false outline.
And even in that case, I mean, remember Hitler gave weapons to Ethiopia because back then him and Mussolini were not getting along. And when the Japanese attacked China, the Chinese were getting aid from Hitler. In particular, officers were helping. German officers were helping to train their men. But anyways, we didn't answer the question about Eisenhower. That was earlier.
Oh yeah, fuck! I forgot about the Eisenhower question. Whether who's the best commander in chief for Europe? Well, I know in our earlier stream we talked about how Jacob Devers probably could have done the job better on a purely military skill level, but he didn't have the kind of PR savvy that Eisenhower had.
Yeah, Eisenhower was just able to get along and work with a lot of complicated people. And then there were exceptions. He didn't get along with Devers or Montgomery, for instance, but he's getting along well with Patton, Bradley, Arthur Tedder, Churchill. So, I mean, Eisenhower was he wasn't great, but he was good.
We also need to
I think
smile when the cameras were pointed at him, which is something most of the generals didn't quite understand.
good point there. But always remember, Eisenhower worked under MacArthur, and they asked him, "What'd you learn?" And he said, "Public relations."
Well, that's true. I mean, MacArthur made himself a major political player after fucking up the Korean War. So I mean, he clearly understood PR.
Yeah. Although I did hear a joke where somebody said, MacArthur thought about running for. There was a push for MacArthur to run for president, like 1948, and a person said, "Yeah, he preferred to be emperor of Japan instead."
To be fair, that was the right decision for him, I think.
Well, it's really weird. Like he was, he's yeah, like it's kind of interesting too for him being such a difficult person. It's like when it came to what he did in the Philippines before World War II and then in Japan, he was able to win a lot of people over, right? He actually had a talent for that kind of thing,
No, he
you know.
did have a certain cachet. I think maybe he would have been politically talented if he lived in an East Asian society. Is kind of what I'm taking away from that. Like he had
It's
a
possible.
charisma for that era or for that area that didn't translate back
And
at home.
yeah, um yeah, but I'd have to read more about that in particular. And once again, we were covering MacArthur in 1944 when it's maybe his high point. 1945, things aren't so good for him. Anyways, um, what's our next question?
Our next question comes to us from Blue Ram's Tetra Sabora for $2 Canadian. Thank you, Blue Ram. They ask, have you read Tower of Skulls by Richard B. Frank?
I've never heard of it.
I
You?
haven't either. I don't know what that is.
I'll look it up. Anyway, what's our next one?
All right. Next one comes from Royston S. Bailey for $5. Thank you, Royston. They ask, do you know anything about the use of dolphins by any side in World War II?
No.
I don't
No, I
either.
do not.
I mean, I feel like
Uh,
that sounds like one of those kooky Cold War era experiments.
yeah, I know the Soviets put money into that. They got that's in that the Adam Curtis documentary about the fall of the Soviet Union, the transition into in the in Russia in the 1990s. They have a he has little things, little inserts in there about the Soviet Dolphin program.
Yeah, I know there was also a program that Stalin funded. I don't know how serious it was, but they did put money into it, where they wanted to try to create a hybrid human gorilla.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think they also did like mind control experiments and all kinds of crazy bullshit. Early Cold War, but I guess after Stalin died, they became a little bit more rational when it came to experiments they made.
Yeah. Oh, Tower of Skulls is a book from 2021 about the Pacific War from July 1937 to May 1942. So just before the Battle of Coral Sea. Looks like it was well received, but I'm glad that was mentioned. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd never
I'll
heard
take a
of
look at
that.
that one.
That makes
Yeah, I'm
sense. For some reason, when I heard the title, I assumed it was like a fantasy novel. But
yeah, same thing. I'm relying on. I have a lot of books in the Japanese Navy, and that's one of my little hobby obsessions. I'm reading John Toland's Rising Sun, the old one from 1970, and to fill in with some of the Pacific War ones, Osprey titles, because Osprey uh, does good World War II stuff in general, um, but like for instance, anything naval World War II that Osprey does that I found is usually top flight. The island stuff, a lot of it's good, but some of them are really dry. You know.
yeah, for
um,
sure.
oh yeah, but I think the book they have on Impal was really good though, and Guam, those two were good.
All right. We have another one from Walk Talk 21 499. Thank you, Walk Talk. Here's the question: alternate history. Roosevelt wins in 1912. Does Hitler ever come to power? If not, what does World War II look like if there's no Wilson in 1912? Okay, that's an interesting question.
There's so much to extrapolate from that one. Does Hitler come to power? I
Well,
don't know.
Hitler still okay. So if Roosevelt is elected in 1912, I guess most people believe he would have gotten the U.S. involved pretty early in World War One. I mean, do you agree with
Yeah,
that?
definitely.
Okay, so obviously this would have meant massively more American casualties, but also the Allies might not have had some of the problems they had early on, like the lack of artillery shells in like 1914 and 15 because of American industry.
That no, no, that would have taken some time. Our industry really didn't kick into a full war footing. It took a while. That's why we were using a lot of Allied equipment, especially aircraft.
Yeah, I guess that might have been different though if we were at war from 1914. Let's
But
see.
but the thing too is that how would the 1916 election go? Would the American public see this as a foreign policy disaster, us getting involved in a war we should not be in, with people suffering horrific casualties? Especially if the United States Army, for some reason, came under the command of, say, the French, not the British, would never come to command the British, right?
Yeah.
Or yeah, you just and at the same time too. Well, of course, Wilson always had to be careful because Irish were a big Democratic voting bloc at the time, and that's one of the reasons why they play up. We're here to help the French out, not the British.
Right. I guess
Then
too.
they don't say not the British; they just emphasize the French, and that's partially political.
So I mean,
Americans can get behind that,
Roosevelt would have
or
been
readily.
ineligible for a second term because he had already. This would have been a second term, so it would have been an open election in
No,
1916. Oh wait, you're right.
no, 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 no.
There's
There are
not the
no
amendment yet. You're right. Fuck. Okay.
no term limits.
Yeah. Um.
There's no term limits.
All right. So.
And think of Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, granted, he wasn't elected in the first term. He fulfilled McKinley after he died. But people talk about Franklin Roosevelt, but I'm like, Grant tried to get a third term. You know, and Theodore Roosevelt essentially did the same thing. So there was a president for it even before Roosevelt got elected in 1940.
So I'm trying to think. I don't know. Maybe if the U.S. was more involved earlier, there would have been more skin in the game after the war, so the U.S. doesn't revert to isolationism in 1918 and
Or
1919.
or the losses are more horrific because we're in there earlier, so we become even more isolationist.
That's also possible. Yeah. And I guess there's even a chance that if things were bad enough early, that the 1916 election would have put in power someone who advocated a return to isolationism, and so the U.S. might have actually only participated in the early parts and then withdrawn. Um,
I
so
mean, there's so much going on here, and also Hitler. Who knows? Maybe he dies now because you've changed the entire tempo of the war
right,
and
yeah.
where
So
he's sent.
it might have been more intense early in the West, and that might have gotten Hitler killed. Um,
That's kind of like what you have to understand. Another one with that too. I mean, yeah, you just mustn't mess around with things. I mean, in Back to the Future, I know like Marty McFly gets to like go back to 1985, and now he has this entire different family, right? If you think
right.
about it,
Well, so
does
I
he have
don't.
any? Yeah, the end of that
Yeah,
movie is secretly horrifying and, of course, impossible because Marty McFly changing things to begin with also means that him and his siblings, no matter what, would never exist because when his parents have sex is now changed. That sort of thing, right?
right.
Of course, I'm not trying to overanalyze Back to the Future here. It's a perfect, great movie. You're there to laugh and enjoy yourself, not be a fucking dork.
Well, anyway, assuming that the U.S. enters early under Roosevelt, wins the war, I think the U.S. would have been more invested in the League of Nations after the war, or whatever would have emerged from the war, because obviously without Wilson, you probably don't have the phrase League of Nations. Um,
I don't even think you'll have a League of Nations. I'm not really sure that's an idea Theodore
well,
Roosevelt would support.
if it's someone who's like Roosevelt, so let's say he does get reelected in 1916 because of war support or whatever, I imagine him being more punitive and being more along the lines of what the French wanted to do and just really soak Germany.
Perhaps I'd have to see. I'd have to see his record with other, what his thoughts were in other peace treaties. I don't know. Uh, yeah, it can't really be said. I'm actually not the biggest person on counterfactuals like this because
Yeah, I
this
mean
one's.
it's interesting though. I'm just trying to give my best.
I like what more micro ones, right? But this one, it's like how this goes from this to this. I no clue, dude. If you ask me in my gut, you know what I say? We become more isolationist. That's what I would say, but I don't know. Nothing's 100%.
Yeah, I guess it also depends on how those early operations go. And actually, I think the biggest impact might have been on the Eastern Front because a lot of times the Germans were able to do those operations because they knew the Allies were limited. But if the Allies have that many more men, especially come like 1915 and 16 when the U.S. is actually mobilized, in that case, that might have really changed the dynamic of the whole conflict.
I mean, it might have. One thing's for sure, they're not going to launch it for done.
Right. Also, more U.S. destroyers in the Atlantic from an early date, so the Japanese U-boat campaign would have been more difficult.
German U-boat campaign, possibly. You have to see if the convoy system might come in sooner rather than later. Then again, the submarine campaign might have been more successful. Keep in mind, the Germans essentially put, in essence, a pause on it in 1916
Yeah.
to try to keep us out. Not to make sure we didn't go in. But anyway, what's our next question?
Next question comes from Oscar Palacios for $5. Thank you, Oscar. And he says, "Hello, here to support your streams. Miss your streams. Do you guys think the right wing will win in France? And also, do you think Macron is an idiot?"
Wow, that's a one. What do you think, huh?
Well, the first part, or second part, I think Macron is kind of an idiot in a lot of ways. From what I understand, I've talked to some people who live in France. Macron is kind of like their equivalent of a corporate Democrat. No one really likes him, and they kind of just vote for him because he's an alternative to Le Pen. But almost everybody who ends up voting for Macron would have preferred to vote for somebody else. So he's definitely got an enthusiasm problem. Um, it
Yeah, he's
looks,
always had that.
yeah, it looks like the right wing in France is poised to win, probably. But with like a minority coalition, because it looks like their peak might be 30 to 35%. But then I guess it becomes a question of who they can actually align with to form a government, which, I'm sure they can find somebody. I don't know. What do you think?
Uh, Most likely, I think they're going to win at this point. They keep gathering more and more momentum, and the right in Europe right now just had a lot of victories. Um, so in Europe across the board, uh, as Macron incompetent. I mean, in some ways, these people, I know I talk a lot of terrible things about him, but it's also like an incentive structure thing, right? I mean, Macron will never be personally punished for the mistakes that he's made. You know, uh, None of these people do,
Right.
and it's my opinion. It's my opinion that the fact that they did not suffer personal penalties 15 years ago, around 2008, with Iraq and the crash and other things, is why they act so incompetently. The incentive structure to act competently is not there. An incentive structure to fleece is there. Also keep in mind too, Macron said like his great goal when he was first elected. I think he said something like was to smash the unions.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean,
so he's not the kind of guy who inspires even a lot of centrists. And the fact that they used him as a way to take away energy from the right, I feel like that's the kind of tactic that can only work for so long
yeah,
before eventually people just say, well, fuck it, we're basically getting the diet version of that right now. We might as well just get the real thing for a change.
I can say that what I have what I have read is that the right in France is winning over young people, um, and it's so much. Whenever you do have extremes, right or left, a lot of times take over in these cases. It is incompetence by the ones in charge. So, if that does happen, it's Macron's fault first and foremost. Also, you keep in mind too, like Marine Le Pen did modifications to the party to make the party more popular. You know,
Yeah.
it's kind of like that thing that what Orban does, where he's like, if you let in migrants, you'll destroy the welfare state, sort of thing.
Yeah,
You
I feel
know,
like
uh,
Marine Le Pen is more politically savvy than their dad was, because their dad, I feel like, scared away a lot of people because he came across as extreme.
yes, yes, and I mean, there's a variety of other things too, like. I think they've changed her stance on Israel, for instance, as compared to before, because I think there were accusations about her father being anti-Semitic, which I think they've gotten away from. But I cannot claim to be an expert on that one. I do know that Macron is. What's goofy about me and Macron is his attempts to try to be a leading European figure and take bold initiatives, but within your like especially with the Ukraine war, and it just always makes him look buffoonish.
Right.
You know, um, so yeah, but yeah, at the same time, I'll say this for Macron: he is not the worst leader in Europe.
No, but I mean that's not saying
I think
much.
I
So
think one country to the north of him and one country that borders the Rhine River have much dumber leaders.
yeah, Boris Johnson is not exactly
Boris
inspiring, or
Johnson's
not. Yeah,
gone.
he's gone. You're right. You're talking about Sunak. Yeah.
Yeah, Sunak's funny because he was installed. I remember I think the World Economic Forum, one of those groups, when he was installed, said we always get our man because he's one of those types.
Oh God. Yeah.
Um, well, yeah, I think the only thing I'd say about that is Liz Truss was funny because there was the head of lettuce thing, about this head of lettuce will outlast her, and she was put in by a lot of the party regulars and faithful, and very much a Thatcherite, you know, and she essentially the especially from what I could tell, the English banks and said they did not like her what she wanted to do, and they essentially ousted her. That's what it looks like to me. And apparently, that's what she runs around saying, almost like she's like, I didn't realize until then that the country's run by bankers. And I'm like, you don't say, huh?
Huh.
I mean, I don't know if she's just saying that self-servedly so she can, try to climb back into power. But it is funny having a person who is the leader of a major country making speeches about like, this country's run by bankers. you know.
Wow. Yeah.
But anyways, but yeah, that's just a disaster over there. But anyways, what's up next?
That is actually all we have.
All right, excellent, guys. Well, that was good. Went longer than I had planned on. So I'm going to see what's up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Apparently, letter W. To go back to an earlier question, he seems to think that Debs might have won in 1916 if Roosevelt had been president in 1912 and taken us to war.
Nope. I really don't see that happening.
That would be one hell of an alternative history scenario, though.
I don't know how that happens.
I don't either, but that would be a fun one.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Eugene V. Debs is a fascinating man, and all the rest, but man, I think that guy had a ceiling of support. You know, but anyways, that's my take on it. America getting involved in the war earlier is a very volatile what if. I just don't like bringing it beyond the war itself as a what if.
Right.
That's what I mean. You know.
We do have
anyways,
we do have a last question of
we
the
have another one?
night. Yeah, and it's from Walk Talk for 999. Thank you, Walk Talk. Last question of the night: do you believe another Wagner-like mutiny will happen in Russia? And are you entirely convinced that everyone who planned the mutiny was purged by Putin?
Oof. I think the problems to run into in that war is, we were like, for instance, neither side tells you the kind of casualties they suffer. They just lie through their teeth, right? So it's hard to estimate that. For instance, the Wagner-like mutiny. They were going to break up the Wagner group because what I could see is that we're going to break up the Wagner organization, and they're going to break them up, and that was a desperate ploy for Wagner to keep a desperate ploy, I think, by Prigozhin to keep Wagner around as a large force or something. I don't actually know exactly what he was doing. I don't think he was trying to topple the government and install himself, though. All right. And if that was his plan, it appears it was also done a bit. It's, to me, always looked rushed and certainly harebrained. I know Michael and other people really, really played up that mutiny. I don't think it was as important. Also, haven't they mostly? Yeah, that's right. Most of Wagner's been redeployed to Africa. They're all over the place over there right now.
Yeah, so I mean, they've basically been banished from Russia for all practical intents and purposes.
That's the thing too. They were using Wagner a bit out of desperation to begin with, right? Because they did not want groups like Wagner operating in Russia. They were supposed to operate elsewhere, but Wagner had a lot of very talented commanders. They were able to raise troops quickly. A lot of that prison recruitment they did, and another thing that happened is a lot of the Wagner appears was also broken up, and they were forcing a lot of their members to sign contracts with the army. And one idea was a lot of the Wagner guys proved to be very good at tactics, and that would mean it would improve the Russian army's tactics as well. Should also be kept in mind that Prigozhin and Shoigu definitely despised each other. Leading to Prigozhin, the colorful character that he was, making declarations against Prigozhin, complaining about not getting enough shells. By the way, fun little Prigozhin story I heard. I don't know if it was FBI, but some American organization was like, we'll pay you if you we'll pay you money if you give us the whereabouts of Prigozhin. This is like in 2021 or something, right? So Prigozhin writes them and says, "Here's my address. Can I please have my reward?"
That's pretty fucking funny.
Yeah, who know an ex-criminal hot dog salesman, right, could do that kind of stuff. It does appear that one of besides Prigozhin dying, by the way, from the aircraft, it was not shot down, but I do think they had somebody. What it does look like is one of the guys who worked on the airplane did disappear later, so I think that was probably what happened. Is
sabotage.
They screwed around. It was sabotage. They definitely didn't missile it out of the air from the stuff we've seen. So I think it was sabotage, and I think one of the Air Force commanders out at Prigozhin, I think recently was ousted, was removed. So, slow going process on that one. But yeah, that's always been the fear of having mercenary companies operating your country from time immemorial. And no matter what you think about Vladimir Putin, that guy's obviously obsessed with history.
Right. Now, I'm actually surprised he built up the Wagner group as much as he did, but I guess he saw it as a prop to his regime until it turned out to be otherwise.
Well, remember they were being used mostly in they were being used in foreign countries, right? I
Right.
mean, we do the same thing with Blackwater,
Yeah.
or is it Black Rock? Blackwater. It's
Blackwater.
Blackwater, right?
BlackRock's a
Yeah,
financial group.
yeah, that's right. I love how these groups choose these names and make you go, huh, it sounds kind of evil. Anyway, so yeah, so Wagner was sorry, yeah, Wagner was out there mostly in foreign countries. I believe they have some in Belarus right now, and they were using them as a stopgate measure at that point in the war. And also the Wagner Group got very very popular in Russia. You know, there's a lot of there's actually was a fair amount of mourning when Prigozhin died, and their men were seen as like the heroes of Bakhmut. This Verdun style battle. So anyways,
Right.
but yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, somebody did say I thought those were pre-existing Wagner forces. I know Wagner already had forces in Africa. I think the ones who stayed in Wagner got reinforced. I do know that yeah, since that war's been fought, you know how like was it like Burkina Faso and those other countries in that area in the Sahel, as they say, were throwing throughout America and France, and then they let the Russians in. So that's Wagner's operating did expand over that way for sure. But yeah, Wagner's I had no idea until like a week ago. Wagner's all over Africa. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense though. Why Wagner would be such a major mercenary company, because the country with the biggest stake in Africa right now are trying to push their interest in Africa is China. And then for China to push it, one way to do it kind of secretly would be to do it through a mercenary company headquartered out of one of their allies.
Yeah.
So my suspicion is that that's why Wagner's all over Africa.
Yeah. All right. So that's pretty much that one. So I guess like what week next week you want to do Japan? Like when do you return?
So pretty much I'm not going to be available this week we're about to start because my sister's wedding is on Friday.
The week already started. It's Sunday.
I know. Just what I'm saying. The week we're in right now. So the rest of this week I'm going to be
Gotcha.
out of operation. But then from Saturday forward, I should be able to stream pretty much whenever I want to because I'll have control of the house. So.
Hmm. All right. All right, everybody. So I'll go and head out, and then I'll do more reading up on the Pacific War. In particular, looking forward to reading about the kamikazes attacking Okinawa. Going to read one book on Okinawa, and I'm actually finally going to read about the destruction, the final destruction of the Japanese fleet, not with the Yamato, but with us bombing them in their Pearl Harbor
Oh wow.
at
Okay.
Kure. Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing I might do this coming week, or this coming week and a half, whatever, is I'm also just about ready to do a stream on the Shu Han generals and historical figures. So those of
Okay.
you who are Three Kingdoms fans.
All right. All right, everybody. So I'm going to head out then. All right. Bye
All
bye.
right, peace out.